Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Congestion Revenue Rights Enhancements Working Group session number 9. Today, we'll be speaking on a few items highlighting product definition, auction efficiency, and revenue adequacy. We do have some engagement best practices to share for today's call, as this is recorded for informational and conveniences purposes only and will be available on the KISO website. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission, and this meeting is structured to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives. As a facilitator, we'll open guidance to submitting questions and comments throughout the meeting, and please keep remarks sufficient and avoid revisiting points that have been already covered to allow spaces for other voices. Closed captioning is still available under the left part of your screen. We don't utilize the transparency viewer at this time with the new WebEx that has modified. The participant list will be opened up when you click all participants as well. For asking a question, you will be asked to state your full name and affiliation, and you will be asked to be unmuted. We do recommend that you pause for about 2 seconds before speaking so we can clearly catch your full name and affiliation. And if you're only connected through audio only through the computer, you use the call me option. Please use the raise hand icon below on your screen. If you're only connected through phone line, not the WebEx, you'll be dialed in through *3 and you'll be added to your question queue. We will be monitoring chat questions as well, but if we do come across a lot of questions, please listen to our panelist group for any questions to be redirected there so we can answer them in a good manner. And if you do experience any technical issues, please reach out to Ryan, our event producer, who is under Inteller. This is an overview of the KISO Policy Initiative Stakeholder Process that we launched a few months ago. This highlights currently that we're within the scope and development phase of this initiative. To learn more about this process, we do have a process guide posted highlighting a little bit more about these phases, as well the current Congestion Revenue Rights Enhancements webpage is up to date with the latest information and materials. Today we do have a really packed agenda. I will be inviting a few folks to kind of highlight anything that I might have missed, but we will be kicking off things with the opening comments from Partha and Hillary, who are currently in the room. We also have Dinesh, who's also on video on a different screen. He will be presenting on a few topics in the latter half of the day. But we do have a 1:25 p.m. start time for the DMM presentation on willing seller from Roger Avalos. He will be joining us shortly, and then we will continue on the auction efficiency willing seller discussion with Hillary. And then we'll take maybe a 5-minute break, depending on the conversation flow, and then wrap things back up with the auction efficiency, revenue adequacy, the option package presentation, and discussion with Partha. And then it will take another 10-minute break, hopefully around 3:55, and then we'll kind of kick things off back with Dinesh, who will be speaking on the product definition time of use period, and also the product definition storage as a sink. And then we'll hopefully wrap things up with the closing comments from our team at the ISO, or any questions you may have had from previous topics in today's meeting. And I'll go ahead and introduce all the leads here who are here today. We do have Hillary, we have Partha and Dinesh, and I do have David Zetlow, who's also from the legal team here participating with any other questions we may have. And then Roger will be joining us shortly as a panelist as well. But let's go ahead and, Ryan, if we can, I'll go ahead and stop sharing, allow the folks in the room to take control.
Okay, give me 1 second.
All right. Thank you, Brenda. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, all of you, for joining us, and welcome to our CRR Enhancements Initiative meeting, the first one since our meeting on January 21st. So we appreciate all of you spending your afternoons here, and we're looking forward to continuing the conversation.
All right, Hillary, you can click the take control button on the top right now.
Thank you. Okay, there we go. Okay, so Brenda covered introductions for us, but you have the full CRR policy team here on the call today, in the room and online. And as Brenda got us started talking about, the goal of today is, broadly speaking, we are going to continue our discussion and consideration of the three major areas that we identified last year in the scoping phase and talked about most recently at the stakeholder meeting about the issue paper in January. So those three areas being auction efficiency, revenue adequacy, and product definition. And along those lines, then, the goals for our meeting today are to continue our discussion of those three areas. So we're going to hear, as Brenda queued up for us, a refresher and a little more detail on one of the ideas that has been raised in the auction efficiency discussion, the willing seller proposal from the Department of Market Monitoring. So we appreciate Roger presenting that. We're then going to have some further discussion about the topic of auction efficiency and how we think about the questions that are going to help us evaluate that and other ideas on improving auction efficiency and revenue adequacy. Talk a little bit about the information that we have heard from you would be useful as we consider those ideas and compare that to the information that we have. And then finally, Dinesh is going to bring us home at the end of the afternoon to talk a little bit about the feedback that we heard on the product definition straw proposal in January and some of the requests we received for further iteration on that. Before we jump in, a couple other notes. So we recognize that there are a number of conversations happening right now that tie into CRRs in some way. So before we get into our scope today, we wanted to just briefly acknowledge what some of those are so that we can touch again on what we're covering here and what is being covered elsewhere. So I'll recognize we have the congestion revenue allocation phase 2 conversation happening. Some of you may have been in the stakeholder meeting that took place last Friday. So that is talking about congestion revenue allocation between different EDAM balancing authority areas. We will not be covering those topics here, but there's a separate process for that. We have heard some comments in the intertie modeling workshops about how the representation of intertie transactions overlays with the CRR framework and process. So we wanted to acknowledge that there's an ongoing series of workshops there where the question of intertie representation is being addressed. And then finally, I wanted to acknowledge we have coming up this coming Monday, the quarterly market performance meeting. And this one we wanted to call out because as we acknowledged at the last stakeholder meeting, I recognize that's been a few months, but as we have gone through our conversation in this initiative, there are some things that we have also been working on within our existing tariff authority that we believe can help achieve some of the goals we have in this initiative on an expedited basis. And as we mentioned then, we do want to keep you informed of that here, even if that is outside the scope of new policy, so you can see how those changes might be helping us on our desired outcomes here. So there was a change that was launched in the March monthly CRR process, the application of the global D-rate factor to contingency constraints for the first time. And at next Monday's meeting, the market analysis group is going to be presenting some results of that in terms of the revenue adequacy numbers for the month of March. So we encourage you, if you're interested, to attend that meeting and review those. With that, we will begin the first segment of our meeting today, which is going to be our kind of combined discussion of auction efficiency and revenue adequacy. And we've brought these two together because, as you'll see, one of the things we're going to be talking about is, of all the options that have been put on the table and were discussed in the issue paper, what are some ways that might make sense to group them together to most effectively achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve here. To start us off, briefly, I want to just reference back to our problem statements. For those of you who have been with us through this whole process, you'll know that last year, one of the outcomes of the scoping phase of this initiative was the development of problem statements. So you have these on the slide, and these are available. Of course, our deck is available on the initiative website, but just briefly, I'll remind us all, we've got a couple of our problem statements are focusing on auction efficiency, recognizing that there was continued stakeholder interest in further improving auction efficiency by the definition that has been used so far in this initiative. We have a couple of problem statements that speak to the concept of revenue adequacy or inadequacy, looking at both how we can further improve revenue adequacy and also the question of what should be, how shortfalls should be allocated when those shortfalls occur. And then our fifth and final problem statement addresses our final topic for today, which is the examination of how hedging needs have evolved since we last revisited the CRR policy in 2018 and the implications that that has for how we can define our products in a way that matches hedging needs. And as many of you will know, we've focused in this area on time of use period definition and discussion of treatment of storage as a sink. So that brings us to kind of the top of our scope for today. I'll pause there momentarily. Are there any questions or comments as we begin? And would anyone else on the team like to add anything? I'll add that we have James Lynn with us in the room as well now.
Maybe I could offer to, maybe we can go to the next two slides and then pause. That might be a more natural break. So this is more just a reminder. We've shared this slide in a number of our meetings, but I think that we're just wanting to sort of kind of have a refresher that like part of the consideration as we look at different design alternatives is do these design alternatives allow us to meet our obligations that are provided, and that there's a number of different precedents as well as responsibility that have been established through sort of a series of orders, rulemakings, and cases. But we look at sort of the broader precedent around financial transmission rights and congestion revenue rights and organized markets. FERC has a number of cases in which they've laid out kind of that foundational purpose and the role of the ISO and RTOs. And that we look at sort of the three main areas, that they were sort of seen as, as we move to, RTO and ISO formation, they were seen as sort of one of the foundational pieces in terms of ensuring that all participants had an open access to the transmission grid, as well as had allowed for the hedging of congestion costs in the context of the day-ahead market at just and reasonable rates, terms, and conditions. And then as well as there's certainly another precedent in terms of making sure that we have fair allocation of transmission revenues to customers who are paying the embedded cost of the transmission system. At least in terms of the CAISO side, we had a number of, there's been a series of cases and orders we established CRRs, which had similar functions and goals, including facilitating long-term contracting by LSEs and generators, as well as fairly distributing congestion rents created from LMP pricing. So let me go to the next slide. One thing that we'll be just discussing here today is different packages of reforms that we could consider as we move towards addressing both revenue adequacy as well as auction efficiency concerns. And I think that for each one of these packages, we're going to have to look at like what are the pros and cons to the various objectives we have on the previous slide. And that kind of at a bare minimum, does this allow us to meet the the requirements and the standards that have been set for us. And that I think in general, what we've heard from the feedback of participants was that, the need for meeting those requirements, particularly maybe I'll focus on allowing for an option where participants can attain hedges at just and reasonable rates. That, we didn't hear significant feedback pushing back on that core function that the ISO provides. So our take is really, as we look at these different packages and options, and we're not going to get to them right here, we're going to have some time after the DMM presentation where we're going to discuss a little bit of what different hypothetical groupings might look like. I think particularly we're looking for stakeholder feedback on, how you view different packages, what the different pros and cons of the alternatives might look like, and then we can have at least a get your feedback and have that information that can sort of roll into our straw proposal associated with these reforms. So I'll stop there, and maybe I'll offer David Zlotlo. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, just in terms of from a legal or regulatory standpoint, how we might consider reform options?
No, I think these are the high level principles, and then as we get into details in the future on this call or other calls, you can always debate about whether the specific parameters of this or that design better or worse meet this principle versus that principle. But I think that's the framing of what the general idea of CRR/FTRs are, what they're here for, what purpose they serve, and what purposes we'd want to make sure they continue to serve with any reforms to the auction allocation or other parts of the CRR processes.
Thank you, David. So we have a couple of minutes. Maybe this is a good time to see if there's any questions on the scope before we get into the DMM's discussion.
Let's see. I didn't see any questions in the queue, but if anyone has a question, please use the raise hand icon located in the middle of your screen at this time. Thank you.
Also, for any of those who want to send a chat question, the layout of WebEx is a little different. Please open the chat panel on the bottom right of the WebEx screen. Using the Direct tab on the top of that panel, select Chat with all panelists. I repeat, all panelists. Type your message in the text box and send.
Let's go take Doug's question. And Doug, please be sure to introduce yourself.
Hi, this is Doug Bochignone from Flynn Resource Consultants for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. On this slide, I don't see on the package one, BAMX had also floated the concept of putting limitations on auction participation that were tied towards a demonstrated use of the transmission system. And I'm just wondering if that's just not on there because it's sort of within the range of the two that are on there, or has there been some kind of determination about whether it's an idea that can be explored further?
No, thanks for taking that, Doug. We actually have that on another slide when we get to the substance. This is, we view these as three packages, and maybe to set the context for folks. One of the options that we're going to discuss first, and it's really based on the fact that it had, a decent amount of stakeholder interest, as well as we had a lot of feedback on it, was the DMM's willing seller design. These other two packages are really more of hypothetical constructs, and I think that your option of limitations is something that I think that we'd love to get feedback on as well. I think that's another option. There are a number of other alternatives that also could be sort of folded into any one of these packages. And what we really wanted to do, try to understand, was a coherent and comprehensive set of changes that would fit well with each other and best balance the various needs of participants while meeting our obligations. So, yeah,
great.
Thanks, Doug.
Great, thanks, Partha, because I do think it could be it could fit within that first package, and even as sort of part of the willing seller design, for example. I think it could be melded with that. So
Thank you.
glad it's still on the table.
Yeah, good clarification. Nothing has been taken off the table at this moment. We're trying to get feedback that allows us to understand the various perspectives on the pros and cons before we issue a straw proposal. So yeah, thanks, Doug.
Great. Thanks.
Seeing no other questions, is there anything else, Hillary, before we move to Roger's presentation?
No, seeing no other hands in the queue, we are ready to move along. So with that, we will move to your presentation, Roger.
Hi, Roger. Just confirming your audio. You may be double muted. Go ahead.
Roger, you are muted.
You guys hear me now?
Yes.
All right, thanks. Sorry, I had to switch audio there. Also asked us to present on the willing seller design. I guess there are some questions about what it is. So this is kind of the last minute presentation. So when you look at all the data, that's going to be why it's not up to date. We just took stuff from previous presentations and we're just going to go over it again so people understand what we're talking about. They're wait for me to.
You will have to let me know when to move on to the next slides. I have control.
Thank you. Yeah, so we'll just go over the main highlights of what the willing seller option design is. We spent a lot of time talking about this before, so hopefully this just kind of summarizes and reminds people. So one of the things which I think some people may have not realized in this process is that the willing seller it doesn't just address the auction efficiency, it inherently addresses auction the revenue inadequacy of CRRs overall. So it eliminates deficit offsets for both the allocation and auction CRRs, and those deficit offsets have been pretty significant, reducing payouts to CRRs by 25 to 30% depending on market type. And also because the CR allocation CRRs have on their own generally been quite revenue adequate before the auction, and the willing seller is by definition revenue adequate and does not add to any revenue. Like there is an opportunity that the ISO could increase the amount of allocated CRRs without creating undue revenue insufficiency. So the basic concept of the willing seller is it's based off just a normal market where buyers and sellers trade with each other. There is a little flair where you could have multiple party trades that interact with each other, or where it finds groups of people where you put them together, their trades clear, which isn't that unusual, but I think some people have a hard time wrapping their head around. There's different parties trading different legs of the trade, but it's pretty simple. The first thing you have to do though is eliminate the 1A restrictions on where you can bid for locations, because those restrictions inherently reduce the ability of people to provide hedges, to sell them, or be counterparties to people willing to buy. With in many instances just how those restrictions So you'd have to eliminate those. Then the ISO will run an auction with only bids from willing buyers and sellers, which means that the ISO would not be offering CRs, $0 price or any other price. This could be implemented, a long time ago. SCE has proposed just setting the limits to 0, and that would get you the same result as not having the ISO offer any contracts into the market. Another way to do that, which is what was done by Frank Wallach and his grad student at Stanford, was to just enforce constraints that the net injections they know are 0. And one of the, there's some just for people to provide liquidity to this market. The main one would be just entities selling, financial entities selling their contracts and the LSEs selling allocated CRs back. And historically, at least for the last few years, they have sold a significant amount of CRs back, about 25% of what they're allocated. So I know we've gone over a lot of this before, but if there's any questions about these aspects of the market design, just like what it, I can take those now.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, let's see if there's any questions from the audience. Please utilize the raise hand icon, and we do have Eric Little who'll go first. Eric, you will be unmuted.
Yeah, thanks. This is Eric Little from CalCCA. I just want to make sure I'm clear, and maybe it's on a different page and we haven't gotten to it yet, but I believe an element of this design was also that you would get rid of the holdback in the allocation process. At the end of each allocation round, there's a certain amount of CRRs that gets set aside for the auction. I'm assuming that if you go to willing buyer and seller, there's no need to do that because you're not auctioning off capability of the grid in general. So would that then all become available for the allocation and not held off for the auction any longer?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's been a while since I remember that one. Yeah, my understanding is you wouldn't need that anymore on one seller. So,
okay.
But people can discuss any other reasons why they want to do that. I can't think of any.
Thank you, Roger.
We do have Jordan next. Jordan, you'll be unmuted, followed by Callie Wells. Go ahead, Jordan.
Oh, can anyone hear me? It's Jordan Miner, CPUC.
Yeah.
Yep, I can hear you.
Thanks, Roger, for this. Can you guys clarify when we say additional counterflow CRRs are offered by financial entities? How are financial entities getting this under the proposal? Are they being allocated them also, or I'm not clear on that part?
It's just a financial contract. They would, offer to sell the contract to pay the beta prices if you pay them enough to take that contract. And, kind of like in any other, forward market, and they'd probably, try to trade a portfolio of those and minimize their costs and risks in the market of doing so. But it's just just a counterparty to a financial contract.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Next, we do have Callie Wells. And I think Eric's hand is still up, just letting you know, flag that for you. Thank you.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. One quick question for you. So I know you mentioned that the allocation process is fully funded. And I believe in one of your prior presentations, you had a chart that kind of showed some numbers there. I was curious, do you guys have a document out there that explains how you're calculating it or how you're getting to that conclusion? Or can you elaborate a little bit more on how you guys are determining the allocation process itself is fully funded? I
Sure. I think that's actually
was trying to find that document, and all I found was that chart in the last presentation.
Yeah, that's actually the next chart, next slide. So we can just move to the next slide real quick.
Oh, hey Roger, if you're going to explain that and walk through it, take other questions. That's fine. I can wait till you get through it.
Okay. Are there any other?
No more questions. Go ahead, Roger. Thank you.
Okay, so the way it's calculated is you take all the allocated CRRs coming out of the allocation process. You don't, if they ended up selling in the auction, doesn't matter, you still count them. And you calculate the notional value of those based off the MCC differences between their sources and sinks. and you sum them up. Then you compare that to the total day-ahead congestion rent. And a small detail there is that the ETCs and PORs are already excluded from the congestion rent for day-ahead, so you also exclude those from the calculation of payments. And that's it. That's the calculation.
We have Callie Wells back to ask a question on slide 3. Let's go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Callie Wells with WPTF. Okay, so I think I understand that, but isn't that essentially just saying that the megawatts that were allocated is just low enough so that all the congestion collected can fund that? I guess I'm having a hard time saying that or understanding that the reasoning is the allocation is fully funded if you're just comparing the total day ahead congestion rent collected to the megawatts of allocated CRRs. Because even after you run the annual allocation process, then you have the annual auction, then you do monthly allocation. So it's almost like you guys are taking the congestion, the day ahead congestion rent, and first saying, is this enough to fully fund the allocation, the CRs that were allocated, and then saying the allocation is fully funded. Am I missing something there? Like a nuance in the calculation?
I'm not sure like you're missing anything. It's just we're looking at the actual allocated CRRs that the LSCs ended up receiving.
And basically you're saying if we only allocated CRRs, we would be fully funded. So I guess I kind of, if that's my understanding, I guess I kind of disagree with the statement that the allocation process is fully funded. You're just saying that if the total CRRs that were handed out between allocation and auction process were the amount that was given out just in the allocation, we would be fully funded. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm following that. We're just saying that these are what they ended up getting before they sold them, so they had to keep them all. We didn't include any of the auction sales. We're saying this is what they ended up getting, and there was a if you just compare that payments to those, what they would have been, that would have been 17% lower congestion rent over this time period.
Yeah, I guess put another way, I guess you could also do the calculation at looking at the total megawatts that were just auctioned off and comparing that to the total day ahead congestion and making the same comparison. I guess I don't fully follow the statement that just by making that comparison, we could claim that the allocation process itself is fully funded. I guess I struggle with that conclusion at this time, but maybe we can talk about this in more detail offline if I'm missing something, but thanks.
Okay, then.
We do have a question from Mike. Let's go ahead.
Hi, Roger. Mike Kramick from Boston Energy. Question: how, under this willing buyer and seller model, how does credit handles? Is the collateral required to transact between the LSC and the entity buying it directly, or is the CAISO somehow sitting in the middle of all this and still having credit calculations? How do you envision that working?
The CAISO would be the central counterparty and handle the credit.
Per using the same type of rules they use today?
Potentially, if there's alteration to that to make the market more efficient, then those can be considered.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I think in general, though, like if you would think about like a non-ISO entity running these markets, a lot of their credit requirements are more sophisticated than the ISOs. Which I'm not saying the ISO should try to copy those, but they do, I think, provide for lower credit requirements than maybe ISO markets would. But it's also careful. ISO have to be careful with how they deal with that in experiences at other RTOs following around credit in the past. But that's a good question.
We do have Abraham. Go ahead, Abraham.
Hi, this is Abram Klein with Happy Way Energy Partners. Thank you for this, Roger. I just wanted to understand the principle or the idea that it's a benefit that allocated CRRs would be revenue adequate, but it really doesn't get at the issue that there is a loss to CRR customers and California ratepayers because of the issues that California has identified, like loop flow and shift factor threshold issues and other kinds of things. So in some sense, it's like you do this, you say, oh, look, we no longer have a problem. And you don't see that, in fact, the ratepayers are being harmed by, one of the significant likely causes of underfunding, which is that entities that are causing congestion aren't paying for the congestion that they cause. And so my sense is that this slide as a benefit doesn't really address that question. It's saying that, oh, we're selling too much, and when we include the auction in addition to the allocation, but the reason we end up selling too much is really because of kind of other factors that are, harming the market.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you could still try to, if there, to the extent there is issues of loop flows causing, revenue adequacy issues, they could still address those. You could still calculate, in theory, what those loop flows are in the market. They do have a full market model that deals with, at least attempts to model those. So, I'm not saying there's not, loop flows are a big issue. There's a whole initiative going on. We're going to talk about potential flow entitlements, network. Everybody's interconnected in the West, so we all affect them too. They create loop flows on our system, and the ISO can create loop flows on their system. So it's a large question.
Next, we do have Doug.
Hi, Doug Boccignone for BAMX. In terms of the credit question, wouldn't it be the case that if an allocated CRR was being sold, that the seller, they'd be unwinding their position, basically, right? So their credit implications would be sort of resolved, just I think like they are today when that happens. So I think you'd be talking about
it would seem reasonable. It would seem reasonable that you could hold their allocated CRR as the collateral to the them putting in a counterflow position into the design.
Yeah.
It will.
So it seems like on the buy side, the credit issues would be sort of the same as they are today, and on the sell side, if it wasn't backed by an allocated CRR.
Right. They could put some collateral, and it does seem like an allocated CRR that perfectly hedges a sold CRR in the auction would be pretty good collateral. But those are details that people can work out as to think about the design.
Yeah. Thanks.
The next question is from Torsten. Let's see, from BAMX. Go ahead. You may be double muted from your mic. Go ahead, Torsten. I'll check with Torsten offline, Roger. Maybe the audio is not coming through, and we'll get their question. They've lowered their hand. Go ahead, Peter.
All right, thank you. Are there any other questions?
No questions at this time.
All right, I guess we can go to slide 4. Yeah, so this is just, again, it's not updated because we could use these from recycling these from old presentations. But this just shows the allocated CRRs, that were sold in the auction, and those that weren't. And you can see that over this 3-year period, the average percent was 25%. So, one of the purposes of having a market mechanism is to allow LSEs to be able to sell allocated rights if they no longer want to hold. But another important factor is this can provide liquidity to a willing seller auction, even if it's not directly related to what, say, a generator would like to use to hedge. It could be negatively correlated with that. So, financial entity might want to buy this as a hedge against them selling insurance to the generator. So having, significant supply of willing sellers of allocated PRs, is an important source of liquidity to a willing seller design. Can we go to the next slide? So yes, Frank Wallach and his student at Stanford, they ran the willing seller design with the no net injection constraints. And we can see here that this was on real actual bid data. And these bids were submitted assuming there would be a transmission. So, there might be a lot of paths, where people would have bid if they knew there was no transmission, especially if they knew that people were going to buy CRRs along those paths, buy transmission, now the transmission's gone, maybe they'd be willing to sell it. But it's the best data we have, and it's before the 1A and 1B restrictions and offsets. So, it's the only kind of set of data that's really efficient for running what this design would be. And we can see that just on the, on the megawatt level, there's still a significant amount of CRRs clearing. There was a lot of concerns when this was first brought up, before the 2019 changes that, nothing could clear. There wouldn't be a lot of liquidity. And the point of this running is that, one, mechanically it can work. And then two, there actually is already a lot of bilateral trading going on, or trading among market participants in the CR auction. And there's a lot of demand for and supply of contracts. If you go to the next slide, this is looking at the information from a dollar perspective. So, we have split out between auction payments or day-ahead payouts. So we can see one of the things you can notice with the willing seller is because it's enforcing that the quantity supply equals quantity demand out of the actual bids, that they are balanced. So if you sum the negative bars and the positive bars, you get 0. We break it out also by auction payments versus data payout. One of the reasons for doing data payouts is when you do willing seller, actually do change. So, it's also nice to look at it with just what the day payouts are, which were also by definition revenue neutral. So there's no insufficiency caused by the willing seller option. And I think another important thing to note is when you look at the negatively priced auction payments, it doesn't really fall that much. Most of the fall is from the auction revenue side and the day ahead payout side. And that's just coming from the removal of the ISO sold contracts through the transmission model. And these negatively priced CRRs, they're provided by both LLCs and non-LLCs. They provide kind of significant volumes of these. So if you go to the next slide, this is just kind of breaking that out. This is just the auction revenue side. You can also get similar numbers for the payout side, but we can see here financial entities, they got $65 million from negatively priced CRRs in the actual auctions, and then in the willing seller at 62. And that's a combination of them still selling a bunch and also going up. But when you look at the data payouts, the percentages don't change too much. That is in our report there, pages 20, 21, if you want to look at it. So there is still a significant amount of selling of these negatively priced CRRs, both in the actual auction and also under willing seller design. And then we can also see that it's not all coming from load. Only a little less than half is coming from load. And we can go to the next slide. And this is breaking out the data by portfolio, or I believe it's actually by bidder. Can't remember. It's been a while. But this is the willing seller data coming from the Stanford study. They broke it out. You can kind of see how the portfolios fit. So the way this chart works is the vertical axis is the payouts with CRs at the day and prices, and then the horizontal axis is what they paid. In this case, it's the willing seller option. And so if you're at that 45-degree line, that means that your payouts that you received equal your payments. So if you're above, it was profitable, and if you're below, it was unprofitable. And if you kind of look at these dots, there's like low serving entities, generators, marketers, financial. They kind of fit kind of what you would, at least in general expect. Again, we're just using the actual bids that were submitted, not knowing what the design, but the financial entities are generally profitable, and the entities looking to hedge or, remove risk by selling out CRRs, are generally less profitable, but, which is what you expect. If you're buying insurance, you'll be willing to, pay a premium to get it or accept a discount to sell the contract. And if you're selling it, like the financial entities are and some of the marketers, you expect them to earn a profit. So these results were all fairly consistent with what one would expect in a functioning market. So we think that's promising. So the whole kind of point of all these studies was just to look and see, like, is it feasible that a market would work? Would there be liquidity? And there's still a lot of concerns about that. So I actually have another slide to go over, but if anybody has any questions about these slides before I move on, it's probably a good place to stop.
We do have a few questions in queue, Roger. The first one's from Mike, and then Eric, and then we'll figure out the next few.
Hey, Roger, Mike Kramer from Boston Energy again. So in this design, the LLCs, sellers, they don't have an obligation to sell anything, right?
No, nobody has obligation to sell the.
They could just hold every allocated CRR they're given, correct? Under your design.
Yeah, they could do that now too.
Correct, but you're saying you're going to give them everything as an allocated. My understanding is your approach gives them 100% of the transmission system as allocated CRRs, and it's up to them to offer them into a willing buyer seller construct, right?
That's correct.
So I guess
Yep.
my concern still is liquidity. If they want to hold them all, how am I as a buyer going to get any?
Well, I mean,
If
maybe
they don't
there's
wanna sell.
one, LLC, there could be market power concerns, but there is quite a few, and they do sell them now. So, if you
Fair
think
point, but
there needs to be some
there's no
more,
requirement for them to sell them. So as a buyer, yeah, I may be able to get a hedge, I may not. So how am I going to? How's that going to make buyers of these products being able to transact if it's a roll of the dice if I can get what I need or not? So I still have liquidity concerns, but
right. So
again,
I guess what I
if
would
they're
say
not
is one,
forced, if they're not required to offer it to me, how can I buy it?
so I say one, the core idea is that you'd have willing sellers providing it, including, competition from financial entities. And as we get to in our later slide, we understand that there are still liquidity concerns despite everything we've shown. So we are providing potential options that can further increase liquidity on top of the willing seller that we think people should consider. I think our stance is that you should start with a core basic market design that follows economic principles without tons of intervention to provide massive amounts of excess liquidity that need to be soaked up by financial entities. Start with a core design that follows economic principles. Then if you think that that's not sufficient to meet your policy goals, then maybe it makes sense to find ways to add liquidity on top of that design. and we talk about some of that in the following.
Yeah, understood.
slide.
I just don't know how this approach meets FERC's open access. Everyone has a fair shot at getting their right to the transmission
Yeah, I think there's been a
system
lot of
under
discussion
this
on
design.
that from both sides of that argument. So I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to go through that. I would just say as an economist, I just think the LNP market provides open access to the transmission. But I understand when we're talking about forward markets, it gets complicated. So I don't want to go into those details right now, but that is a conversation that is happening right now. So
Appreciate it. Thank you.
thank you.
Next is Eric Little. We do have a lot of folks on queue, so if you can keep your comments a little bit brief, that'll be appreciated. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, I'll try to make it fairly brief, but real quick on that last point, I disagree that if everything is allocated, there's nothing available. This is a willing buyer and seller, so just like in a bilateral market, people can take the opposite side of something. So if somebody feels that the counterflow is not going to be as bad as somebody else is estimating, they can still make deals. So there is no reason to believe that there won't be transactions outside of what gets allocated. But my question really is on slide 5, and you had the amount that cleared. Just a question, when you've got those marked out versus by financial market or generator and load, for load in particular, does that include both the buy side and the sell side that 83% would clear, or is that only looking at the buy side or only
That
looking
was
at the sell
both.
side?
It was
It's
both.
both. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you,
So
Roger.
we do in the report have it broken down in many other ways. This was just to
Okay.
show, kind of a high level.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Next, we have Torsten back on queue. Let's double check their audio. Try again.
Hi, this is Torsten Keeper. Am I coming through this time?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Very good. Yeah, I had to change my audio. So first, I wanted to say that on, I think it was page 3, the comparison between auction and allocation, that what I understand from this slide is that once you add in the auction CRRs, it has a dramatic effect on the overall surplus. And that begs the question of, where that source really is. So I would really like to see more analysis on the sources, both allocation and auction. And it does kind of stand to reason that if you're offering up too many auction CRRs for a $0 bid price, that they certainly would contribute to the shortfall. Seems to stand to reason. Moving, I think it was back to page 8. I think it's striking that the winners and losers in this figure are very similar to the winners and losers in the current CRR market. I've done some analysis very similar to this, but looking at current outcomes. And it's striking that the entities that would be seeking a hedge and paying a premium for the hedge continue to decline here. And the entities that might be providing some additional liquidity are receiving a premium for it. So it seems like from an economic standpoint, that's the outcome we would hope for. And finally, just to touch on the allocation liquidity concerns, as part of my analysis, I've also been looking at who has been selling and who has been buying CRRs in the current framework. And allocation recipients sell, tons of CRRs in the current framework. And so I don't see any reason to believe that that would change under a different auction structure. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, it's Doug Boccignone for BAMIC. Just wanted to offer one clarification as well, that it's not that the entire transmission system gets allocated. There are limits on the volume that are allocated, which are tied to the historical load of the LSE. So, it gets allocated up to the amount of their loads that are allowed to nominate. So, there's
Right,
still going to be.
It has to sync up their loads as well. So there's actually a lot of restrictions on what people can do in the allocation than in the auction. It makes it hard to avoid the constraints like you can in the auction.
Exactly. So there will be transmission out there that if people are willing to take a sell position, they could do so.
Go ahead, Doug. Oh, I think that was his last point. Next, we do have Abram.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to point out, I think one of the challenging aspects of this model in that the CRRs that a hedger might want to buy are not necessarily the CRRs that are allocated to in the auction to load serving entities. So one of the advantages, Roger, you talked about speaking as an economist of the existing auction design, is it allows for reconfiguration. When you have thousands of buses across the system and generators in far-flung areas, that maybe they're looking to go to a load zone, but maybe they're not. Maybe they just want to get out of their generation pocket and go to some other location or build a portfolio of CRRs that is, correlated with their basis risk. But there's a lot of reasons that entities, and I know because I was head of trading for an IPP for 10 years at Edison Mission Marketing and Trading. And one of the real advantages in the CRR auction as an economist is that it allows for this efficient reconfiguration of the system because you don't have to exactly match buyer and seller. I just want to acknowledge that that's a real loss from this particular market design, which I think is going to be very problematic from an open access standpoint. We certainly don't need to debate that, but I'll just point out that at the origin, when California was having its debates about whether to even have zonal pricing versus LMP in the 1990s, the argument against LMP was it would crush liquidity in the forward market, and financial marketers or generators wouldn't be able to hedge, and there just wouldn't be liquidity. And so it's better to have simply a single price market, which of course is, we found out really doesn't work. The market design answer, or the orthodoxy from the LMP design, is that FTRs are a critical component of and that auctioning off the FTRs is part of the open access requirements under Order 888. Remember that FERC ordered the transmission owners to make their transmission available to anybody who could get it on a first come, first served basis in order to facilitate competition. And so I just want to point out with this that is very hard to accomplish the efficiency enhancing role of CRRs for not just LSEs but all kinds of participants in the competitive market, particularly generators who want to hedge, whose desired CRR,
so if I could
CRR
respond
portfolio. Let me just finish, Roger. But the desired CRR portfolio may have CRRs that differ from what is allocated to LSEs that they might be open to selling.
Yeah. So first, I'd be hesitant to say that the current market using the SFT has shown any sort of efficient pricing. That it's done in an efficient way. It's done in a very cheap way for a lot of entities buying it. Two, yes, there are often market participants who want to trade something, and other market participants who want to trade something different. And a lot of times, that's a problem markets usually work to solve. And one of the main, not only, but one of the main functions of financial entities is to kind of be the in-between there. So, in most financial markets, you have a lot of market makers. They're buying and selling both sides, and they're offsetting the trade. So, I mean, it seems like it makes sense to me that, yeah, there's a generator who, wants to go to a trade hub, which seems like a pretty reasonable place to go if you're trying to hedge. There's not going to be a lot of CRRs being sold by LSEs coming from a trade hub because they're not allowed to sync there in the allocation. So, but if if LSE is selling that CRR, that can be used to offset the risk of selling a CRR to that generator, their financial entity. So, there's a lot of ways they can construct portfolios where they can offset the risks and it'll never be 100%, but they can manage those risks and they can earn the spread on that. So I think that's kind of the idea for how, a financial market would work. I do understand that many people are very concerned about liquidity still, so we will also talk about that later on as well.
Yeah, I just point out, I don't think there's any other market in terms of the number of individual locations that are traded compared to an LMP market. There's probably thousands within California, each with a different location. Each generator has its own location, and an entity wanting to buy those really needs to be able to access the transfer capability, not the specific CRR that is allocated to LSCs, but the transfer capability that they're offering back when they sell. I think it's a very serious consideration for California market participants to really think about.
Well, thank you for your input.
Next, we have Noah, and then we do have Bonnie Blair. Thank you.
Yeah, have you thought about, we've had several participants that are interested in, investing in things like battery storage, and they've really raised concerns about not being able to use the product for hedging purposes. And given the liquidity concerns that are raised, are you concerned about that increasing the cost of hedging moving forward, and thus the cost of development and new technology in the space? Because that's certainly one concern that we have. And I apologize, I didn't introduce myself. It's Noha Sid Home on behalf of the Energy Trading Institute.
Yeah, I think our response is that, if people are buying hedges, they should be paying market prices for those hedges, not prices that have been distorted down.
But are you concerned that the lack of liquidity is going to make the hedge? They're already saying the hedging is ineffective, and it's because of the underfunding issues that are occurring. Like, we have more than 100% underfunding, which I think is probably driving some of the pricing that you're seeing and are unhappy with. So my concern is that the cost of the hedge, that is going to be nearly impossible for them to hedge their basis risk using this product if it becomes,
I'll respond.
if we don't fix the
that
underfunding issues and we
worse
exacerbate it with
before the
liquidity concerns.
offsets. And two, if we're looking at these data from, again, 2017-18 before the offsets in 1A, and we can see that there was then, a lot of entities that were selling CRRs to provide liquidity, with financial entities, in addition to buying up the excess liquidity provided by the ISO. So, but again, as I said to several of the commenters, we do understand that people have liquidity concerns. And so, we will have a slide coming up where we'll just talk about ways to deal with that. And I also do understand that this is a very, large market. You talk about nodes. So, but it works for energy markets. So I think, if people have particular liquidity, there are things you can do to address that. So maybe I'll just chat, and maybe I should go to there unless there's any other questions.
Noah still has her hand raised, so let's go back to her. Her follow-up question, she had one. Go ahead, Noah.
No, sorry, I just didn't lower my hand. We can move on.
Thank you. I did see a few folks lower their hands. I'll take a few seconds just in case they want to raise their hands back up. We do have a few more minutes in case. But Roger, go ahead and proceed. No hands at this time.
If we go to the slide after all the scatter charts, I think that's the only thing people like to hear. So yeah, so there are concerns that people have with liquidity. Are they be able to get hedges? for their contracts or market participation. Um, there are lots of ways, like, oh, there's all these nodes people want. How are people going to find them, make a market for them? I mean, one thing you can do is you can have people express interest in what products they would like. They can say, hey, I'm interested in this source and sink and this quantity. So people know if they want to make prices, selling those, they can do that. There's also other option formats. Not all has to be a single round blind field bid auction. You could have multi-round formats. I'm not sure the ISO prepared to, they might need outside help to go for those, but because we only do the one type of auction here. But there are other types other than what the ISO runs for all its markets. And then if there are concerns about liquidity for any seeking to hedge, and that's a policy concern, the ISO right now is selling contracts to do that, and they're doing it in what I consider a very non-targeted and not particularly limited way. So, if they want to, rather than just offering at $0 prices, they can target and limit intervention to sell these contracts still. You could start and say, hey, let's let the market do it. And if the market can't provide it, then we will, sell contracts that are targeted a limited way to entities that we think are going to hedge, which is the policy purpose of the intervention, and do so in a responsible way that, is trying to, price that correctly and always have, rational reserve prices rather than $0 reserve prices, or just $1 or some fixed price for all CRRs when we know that all CRRs have different values. And it could just be designed as a backstop. If the willing seller design does not provide sufficient liquidity, however that's defined, first you want to maximize use of the market mechanism, and then the ISO can, rather than intervening in the middle of the market while it's running, they could provide backstop and sell contracts that they have available, or, just be that. And to me, I think here at DMM, we think it makes more sense to start with a core design based off core economic principles and economic theory, not just set theory that mistakes math used for fixed factors for swap products, but core economic theory. Start with that, and if there's a policy reason to intervene, do that in a targeted, limited way, which is how any intervention for policy purposes should be done to begin with.
We do have one question from Doug. Roger, let's go ahead and take his.
Yeah, Doug Boccignone for BAMX. Just a comment and then a question on this last point. It seems like sort of consistent with what BAMX has suggested. If you could use the historical use of the grid, the generators and marketers who are actually injecting and withdrawing from the grid, would be the ones who would be eligible for this type of treatment. But I also wonder, would there be a way to integrate their participation in the willing seller auction, whereby you're allowing them to bid and potentially clear up to their full quantity, based on the historical, sort of like LSE's seasonal eligible quantity. Could that somehow be integrated into the willing seller design, whereby the ISO then up to those quantities does sell the capacity?
Well, I think to me it makes sense to give the market the first shot, so market participants can make a market price, because the ISO is going to be doing that. You have to do their own reserve pricing. So you could intervene in the middle of the market and be providing it alongside, or kind of what we were thinking, you could, say, hey, if you want to get a backstop mechanism, you have to meet these requirements or whatever, and you have to bid into the willing seller option. And if they don't clear you, then maybe there's a backstop option. We think that a mechanism that would do that was targeted to policy purpose of selecting hedges, that could help people get to the willing market. We think that solves the biggest problem and concern that people have with the willing seller design.
Yeah, no. Makes sense. Thanks.
No questions at this time.
Well, that's the end of my slides. So thank you all. And if there's any last minute questions, just let me know.
Thank you very much, Roger. With that, we will move back to our other presentation here. All right. So thank you, everybody. Roger for the presentation and everyone for the engagement. And what we're going to do in the next section here is kind of an extension of that conversation, where we're going to talk about, there are some elements that already came up in Roger's presentation that we're going to pull out and add a little bit more interpretation on, in the sense of how we're thinking about evaluation of some of these potential costs and benefits and risks as we go forward and work towards the straw proposal, both for the willing seller idea, and I think a lot of these can be applied to some of our other auction efficiency ideas more broadly. So just a couple things that we wanted to call out at the start here as we're broadening the conversation from Roger's presentation on that specific idea to auction efficiency more generally, is that as captured in our problem statements, there's strong interest in continuing to improve auction efficiency. We want to recognize, and as Doug already called out at the beginning here, that we focused on willing seller so far in this conversation today because we wanted to make sure that we had a good refresher on what that was, but we recognize that's also not the only idea that has been introduced in this area so far, notably including the proposal from BAMX last year on limiting access to the auction. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about how we're thinking about evaluating these ideas around improving auction efficiency, including the willing seller design idea, and then transition, as Parthak kind of gave us a preview of at the beginning, about what that means for how we might group some of these options together into packages that make sense and could help us improve both auction efficiency and revenue adequacy. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because I think our conversation just now captured a lot of these key features. Just kind of a quick refresher on some of the key points here that we wanted to make sure we're keeping in mind as we're considering this idea. I think one thing I want to highlight, which Roger already did in the course of the Q&A, is that part of this design involves relaxing the 1A restrictions on the types of source sync pairs that can be bid on in the auction. That is important for some of the analysis requests that we've received around willing buyer, willing seller. And I also want to note, let's see, that on our next slide here, and this is pulled from the original willing seller paper that is part of the record for this initiative, just to emphasize that the idea here moves from a topology-based model that we use in the auction today to one that is purely based on net zero injections at all nodes. So we're moving away from the physical representation of transmission capacity to purely a financial network. But I won't spend a lot of time on that because I think we had a rigorous Q&A that really highlighted a lot of these things. And so as we move into thinking about how we evaluate these ideas, I want to call out a few key themes that were captured in the record so far on these auction efficiency ideas. especially, we began this initiative in November 2024, so we recognize there's been a long record established. So we wanted to call out, for example, there has been feedback and some questions from the Market Surveillance Committee. This is also on the public record, although not part of this enhancements initiative. But I just want to recognize that as we were talking about the willing seller design there in the aftermath of the root cause analysis presentation last March, there were some questions. I think some of these have already come up in the Q&A just now, such as how different use cases for hedging that are currently relying on today's auction would be able to get CRRs under that construct. I want to call out, since we had some questions about what we can assume about whether LSEs will continue to resell under a willing seller design or other auction designs as they have been in the past. I want to note that the MSC also had questions about the other direction there, to the extent that a load serving entity that sells today would like to continue to do that under a willing seller design. Do they still have the ability to do that? What is the likelihood that there's going to be someone willing to take the other side of that transaction? And I think another option or another item that we've touched on already is the idea of knowing what's going to be available in the auction and how much the willing seller requirement would impact both bidding behavior and ability to get what hedges are desired. I'm going to call out also some major themes that we've heard from stakeholders here in this initiative record, which we're going to delve more into this on the coming slides. But just to reiterate, all three of these have come up already, but major themes: are we going to be able to procure the CRRs that are needed to meet hedging needs under a willing seller design or any other auction design that we were to undertake in order to improve auction efficiency? We've touched on the question of whether a design under consideration, whether it be willing seller or another, fulfills open access requirements and the other core functions of CRRs as set by the FERC precedent that Partha mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And also, this one we have talked about a little bit less so far today, but has been very present in the record so far. Questions about how auction changes would impact the broader energy market, including the pricing of bilateral contracts. So we wanted to acknowledge these have been the three main themes. And building off of those, we wanted to spend some time talking about, as we are evaluating these ideas and working towards a straw proposal, how can we think about assessing the likely risks and benefits of different ideas? And so this section is going to be built around our first point there, thinking through what are the current use cases for hedging instruments today, which is to say for CRRs today, and what questions do they raise about the potential impacts of change? And so the questions in our last segment already provide excellent examples of this. Cases where the auction today is being relied on in a certain way, and what do we know and what do we not know about whether that same function would be able to be fulfilled under the willing seller design. So our next bullet there, this is our core question: how would a willing seller or alternative auction framework create risks to the core objective of maintaining a liquid and efficient congestion hedging market that supports both long-term and short-term procurement and facilitates open access? And so we're focusing on risks in that question. Of course, that goes both ways. There could also be benefits, and we're trying to, as best we can, as we're evaluating these ideas, look at both of those and identify them as best we can. And another thing on our final bullet point there that I think our conversation under Roger's presentation has already picked up is that, on the one hand, liquidity is a central part of answering these questions. The outcomes of an auction like this and how much liquidity we do see or we would see in that auction is important to answering the question of, does this design fulfill the requirements that it needs to fulfill? And we'll talk a little bit in the next few slides here about what the analysis that we have today around that question shows us and what it doesn't show us, and what that means for the amount of uncertainty that we have to bear as we choose between these options. So we recognize that liquidity is an important part of answering these questions. At the same time, it's not the only part. Any design that we select, it needs to allow parties the opportunity to hedge congestion with just and reasonable rates, terms, and conditions, facilitating open access, which of course is another piece that we have already touched on as well. So with that framing in mind, we are now going to go through a couple different categories of use cases for hedging instruments that we have pulled from the record that stakeholders have provided through engaging in this initiative so far. So we've tried to identify some key questions associated with each of these different hedging use cases. And what we'd encourage as we go through here and you're thinking about questions or comments is, are these questions an accurate distillation of what you have put into the conversation so far? Is there anything that we should be looking at differently? Are there questions that we should be asking that aren't there? So let's talk about some of these cases. We'll start with long and short-term procurement effects. And I think the hope is, and I think our conversation so far has illustrated this, a lot of these should not be new. They're meant to be a distillation of the comments that we received over the past year and a half. So case in point, our first one here, what are the implications of reduced liquidity or fewer actively traded hubs and paths? I think that we got to just at the end of Roger's presentation, for example, and we'll talk a little bit about in the analysis slides, there's a lot of uncertainty around not just liquidity overall, but what liquidity on specific paths would look like. And those outcomes have implications for different types of hedging. So what are the implications of reduced liquidity or increased liquidity overall and on specific paths? And would counterparties still be able to efficiently transact in needed volumes and tenures? How would the bid-ask spreads and transaction costs change in contracts? How would the design impact resource-specific hedging strategies? Notably, as we are discussing in the product definition area, storage was not nearly had not nearly the market penetration that it does today when we last looked at this structure in 2019. And then what evidence from current procurement practices can inform possible future impact? So what we're trying to capture with this category is what overall impacts would auction changes have on procurement practices. I know we have stakeholders on both sides of those transactions here, so it's an important category. And that last bullet point there really is what we're trying to capture. What does how we use the system today tell us about the impacts of potential changes? Moving then to the generator side, we wanted to call out a few here. How do the current hedging structures in generator contracts today indicate potential risk from an auction design change, such as willing seller? What are the alternatives? You know, if the current structures become less effective, what are the alternatives out there? What would be the impact of fewer liquid trading points? For example, if the liquidity in a willing seller auction was concentrated around the trading hubs, what would that mean? And what would be the impact on the bilateral markets and their relationship then with the auction? Would the bilateral markets need to expand? Is there additional congestion price risk that would attach to bilateral energy or capacity products? And what impact would this have on bilateral prices? And again, we have some indication of this. We have some stakeholder perspectives on this in previous comments, including on our January 21st meeting, talking about potential bilateral price increases. So we want to recognize that is in the conversation. Looking at price transparency, what are the implications for transparent forward congestion pricing? I think we have heard on a number of occasions that the auction as it is today plays an important role in price discovery for forward congestion hedging. So we want to make sure we're taking that into account. What would lower liquidity? Would lower liquidity impair visibility into expected congestion costs and volatility? And how would procurement entities price bilateral contracts without CRR forward market signals, or if those market signals are weaker than they are today. And then our last category here, also something that we have already touched on, looking at load portfolio reoptimization and migration risk. We know that for entities that are serving load changes throughout the course of the year, sometimes the course of the month. So what would this mean for opportunities to reoptimize portfolios, including the scenario where load is moving, migrating throughout the year? We have our annual process around that, but more broadly, are we providing sufficient opportunities for portfolio reoptimization as load migration takes place throughout the year? So I'll pause there, and this is something that when we take comments on this meeting, if there are additional categories, additional hedging use cases that we should be considering that you feel haven't been fully included here, those are welcome. We're going to talk next a little bit about analysis. Actually, I see a question from Callie. So why don't we pause there and take questions?
Go ahead, Callie.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I actually had a clarifying question. I think it was back on slide 17 when you're going through the key concepts. I just want to make sure I fully understand this willing buyer, willing seller design concept. I think, let me see if I can find it's yes. So on 17, it says auction CRRs are no longer funded by congestion revenue. So am I correct in understanding that what that means is any CRR that is cleared through, I'm going to call it the willing buyer and seller design, it is going to simply be paid based on the clearing price in the auction, and it's not going to be linked to the actual day ahead congestion? Or am I misinterpreting that bullet point?
Maybe I can make a suggestion. I think Roger is still on the call. Would you like to respond to that question? I'm happy to respond if you're not available, Roger. I think you're trying to, we can't hear you, Roger.
Sorry, I was double muted. Because remember the two charts where we did the money, both the option revenues and the day-ahead payouts netted to zero. So the funding for both the option revenue and the day-ahead comes from each other's counterparties. So it's just like all these other futures contracts, the payouts come from my counterparty. That's why it's inherently revenue adequate.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm just trying to, like, from a very simplistic standpoint, understand how would, so if I clear a CRR in this willing buyer and seller design, what is the revenues I get? Is it going to be based on the day ahead congestion price differences?
Yes, or total LMP differences. There's no reason not to include losses.
So the CRR is not, okay, sorry. The CRR is going to be paid based on the LMP differences now, not just the congestion
component. You could do MC
component?
differences, you could do LMP differences.
So
for
are we
simplicity,
looking...
we'll just say MCC differences if you want to keep up the current CRRs.
Okay, I guess where I'm going, and maybe this is kind of bringing up something I think might be, and again, I just want to make sure I fully understand this. So as we go through the implications, it's very clear. Is there going to be a change in how these CRRs that are acquired through this willing buyer and seller design going to be settled versus CRRs that are allocated to the LSCs? I'm not expecting an answer or discussion right now. I'm just saying maybe that's a point that would be worth exploring and discussing as kind of we go through all the different categories that you raised. Because there's a shift in how it's being settled and the value of it versus the CRRs, how they're being settled and the value of those that are allocated. If we're kind of creating a difference there, I think it would be something that we're going to want to think through.
Right. So if you just settle on the MCC differences, it'll all sum to zero. People will be making payments paid. They are. So if you want to make consistent the allocated, which makes a lot of sense, you just the MCC differences. And everybody gets settled that way. And the funding comes from that settlement.
Okay, sorry, you cut out there for a little bit. I think I understand what you're saying, so I appreciate that. But yeah, maybe this is just something that we can think through and discuss as we kind of go through the different categories that you just raised, Hillary. Thanks.
Thank you, Kelly. We have another hand from Eric.
Yeah, hi, Eric Little, CalCCA. Just a question on the second bullet on this. Is there any proposal to change the current mechanism? Because there is a mechanism when when a load changes LSEs, there's a mechanism already for moving a slice of the CRRs from the LSE that lost load to the one that gained load. We're not proposing to change anything here, are we?
So obviously there's not a proposal on the table right now. I think it's really just acknowledging the fact that there's a couple different ways that there's a couple different use cases that load has. Like one of them is obviously that when the allocation comes in just for general LSDs, often the allocated CRRs won't fully meet the hedging needs. And so there's a sense that like there's a need for re-optimization. There's obviously a load migration process that would include a change in the CR positions. There's also been a sense that the auction provides an additional opportunity for when load migration happens for a more accurate, the use of the auction allows them to sort of reconfigure those rights to better serve their needs versus just what happened as a part of the load migration procedures. So that's really was kind of like the acknowledgement and then kind of like an open question of if this market, if the whatever changes are happen decrease liquidity or decrease the ability for that optimization, that re-optimization could happen, what are the risks placed upon loads from those two functions? So that's I think what the questions we're teeing up.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
We have Jordan Miner also with another question. Let's go ahead.
Hey, Jordan Miner, CPUC Energy Division. So when we say hedge needs for customers that switch LSC mid-year, I'm primarily thinking about customers who leave the IOUs to go to CCAs. But how big of a concern is this really? Because we haven't had any big CCAs start in a few years now. So is it really that much low migration mid-year now?
That's a good question, Jordan. And maybe I'll say generically on these questions. I don't think that we have easy answers to any of them in terms of what the scope of the challenge might be. And that's something in particular I think that we'd love to hear feedback from market participants as we develop the alternatives to say, hey, this is something that really affects us and has a meaningful impact. You need to make sure that the processes allow for effective re-optimization for this hedging purpose. So for each of these slides, I think there's probably an open question that you're asking a good question that I'd probably love to hear from other participants as well, just in terms of what does the scope of this issue look like? Are there other ways in which people could re-optimize for this function? But that at least would be my response. I'd love to hear from other participants. I don't know, Hillary, did you have anything else I was missing there, or?
Not really. The only thing I'll add is just, I think at this point, the main thing we want to do is make sure we're not missing any key ways that the system is being used today. We want to make sure that we're not missing any use cases entirely. And then going forward, as Partha said, part of the consideration going forward is looking at the magnitude of each of these. So, so we want to make sure that it's on the list. And to the extent, as you said, Partha, that there's information about how much of an impact that could have, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary and Partha. I'll make sure to.
All right, seeing no more hands in the queue. Having gone through that list of questions, the next thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about the information that we have available to answer them so far. And in particular, we wanted to give an update on our thinking on some of the analysis requests that we've received over the course of the initiative so far. And so we're going to start with one of the earliest ones that came in, which is as we're considering auction efficiency changes, which is to say auction structure changes, and in particular the willing seller design. One of the things that we have heard is that there is interest from market participants in trying to get a sense of how would their hypothetical results under a willing seller auction compare to actual results in recent past auctions under the current structure. And so Roger talked a little bit about, you saw some of the analysis that DMM has provided on the record in terms of their attempts to simulate willing seller. And so we wanted to talk a little bit more about what that analysis tells us, what it doesn't tell us, and what there is potential to look at going forward. So first of all, I wanted to call out the fact that when we're looking at recent auctions, and Roger mentioned this, but I just want to emphasize it and walk through it a little bit more. So when we look at recent auctions, which is to say post 2018, when the most recent CCA policy changes, CRR policy changes went into effect, those changes, especially the 1A restrictions, created a barrier to using post 2019 auction data to simulate willing buyer, willing seller. So we wanted to talk a little bit more about why that is, because we recognize that it's an important question whether the willing seller auction would provide results that are similar enough to the current auction result that they're meeting hedging needs. So what was it about the 2019 policy changes that makes it difficult to simulate willing seller results post 2018? What were the changes? The CRR 1A changes put restrictions on the source sync pairs that you can bid on in the auction. That is in place today and has been since 2019. And then we have talked already in this initiative much more about the CRR 1B changes. We've heard feedback from some stakeholders that adopting that methodology of allocating shortfall to CRR holders rather than having it uplifted from load has changed some of the pricing behavior in the auction because it has increased the uncertainty around CRR payout. So both of these are worth considering in terms of what they mean for simulating willing seller design results with post 2018 auction data. But in particular, the 1A restrictions do present a categorical barrier because those source sync pair restrictions limit the types of bids that can be submitted. And as we touched on as the conversation touched on in Roger's presentation, liquidity and the amount of counterflow CRR that clear are an important part of the willing seller results. And there are certain types of bids that would be available under willing seller because, as Roger mentioned, part of that idea is to roll back the 1A restrictions. But because those restrictions were in place starting in 2019, those bids are missing entirely from the data set. And so what we wanted to emphasize here is basically that the ability to simulate willing seller results since 2018 is categorically restricted. It's not going to give accurate results. And this is something that DMM recognized in the paper with the choice to simulate willing seller results with 2017 and 2018 data, because that is the most recent data that we have before those restrictions went into place. So I want to call out a couple of other things. I think the conversation already touched on this, but the reason that we're going through this is to talk a little bit about why more recent simulation in more recent years is difficult, but also how we should interpret the most recent simulation we do have, which is from 2018. So we already saw some of those results. We're going to call out a few of them here on the next few slides. And one of the things that we invite you to consider is, on the one hand, 2018 is the most recent data that we can use for these simulations. On the other hand, the grid has changed a lot since 2018. That data is 8 years old now. And so as we look at these results, one of the things that we think it is important to be thinking about is, what is the potential applicability that far forward in time? So we wanted to talk a little bit more just about two of the figures that are on the record around this idea. Roger included them as well in his presentation, but just to talk a little bit about, what do they show us, what do they not show us? And this is even on top of course, the inherent uncertainty around past data not providing perfect clarity of view into the future. But even on top of that sort of general uncertainty, as Roger mentioned, the simulation of the 2017-2018 data, on the one hand, indicates that there would be some volumes that would clear under the willing seller design. You can see that varies significantly by sector. But one thing that we want to emphasize, because we see that simulating individual results has been important to stakeholders as we've gone through this process and we've gotten questions about it, we do want to emphasize that aggregate results, of course, do not tell us necessarily what individual portfolio results would have been. And so, for example, when we look at simulated cleared volumes on an aggregate basis, this does not tell us where those volumes are clearing. So, for example, if there are certain paths that have higher activity under today's auction structure and would have lower liquidity under willing seller, we can't tell that from from aggregate cleared volume results, even if those results were an effective forward-looking proxy at an aggregate level, and it doesn't tell us about price changes. And similarly, with the metrics looking at auction revenue and payout, these also were included in Roger's presentation. We want to emphasize it's kind of the same thing. On the one hand, we appreciate that this analysis uses the most recent data that we can use for this kind of simulation, which is why we have not looked at any of the more recent years. On the other hand, looking at an aggregate level, even if the aggregate results are a useful estimate, does not tell us what individual results are going to be. So, for example, this table is looking at simulated counterflow clearing results, and even if it gives us a useful metric on aggregate auction revenue from counterflow CRRs, it doesn't tell us what the clearing volumes of specific paths are going to be or how the prices would be changing. So it's something that we want to just, I think listening to the Q&A and the back and forth earlier, we've already touched on this, but we just wanted to spend a few extra minutes on it, because we recognize on the one hand that getting as much certainty as possible around how this might impact individual portfolios is an important part of considering these ideas. On the other hand, there are some structural reasons why the more recent auction data doesn't work for that, and why even looking at the 2017 and 18 results doesn't tell us individual outcomes. So just to sum it all up, we wanted to, on the one hand, recognize that DMM, in the course of the conversation about the willing seller idea, has already provided aggregate simulation with the most recent auction bid data that is appropriate to use for that kind of simulation due to the restrictions imposed in 2019. At the same time, because of that data is 8 years old. The grid has changed significantly since then. And on another level, aggregated simulated results also don't predict individual outcomes. So one thing to take away from this, as we're talking through this and going forward, there are additional ideas on how we might help stakeholders parse the risks here, even knowing that we can't do auction simulation of recent years, we'd welcome that kind of feedback, because we recognize that this is an important area of inquiry for stakeholders. Lastly, I wanted to touch on one additional data request. This came in more recently in the comments on in the comments on our January 21st meeting. I do also see we have a question in the queue. I've got one more slide in this section, so I will finish this out and then we'll take questions before the break. But this is another area that we touched on already, the question of the revenue adequacy of allocated CRRs if you take out the auction CRRs. And so one thing that I want to note is this is another question that can be asked on both an aggregate and an individual level. So I wanted to note that because of the way that CRR 1B is applied, it's not feasible to get constraint by constraint or stakeholder specific answers to this question, because CRR 1B in the settlement process is applied on a portfolio netting basis. So the presence of auctioned and allocated CRRs in a portfolio input, they both play a part in that portfolio-wide netting when CRR 1B is applied. So constraint by constraint results aren't feasible, but the best we can do is look at an aggregate level. And so Roger provided one take on that already in his presentation. We wanted to call out that also in DMM's December 2024 comments at the beginning of the initiative, they also provided some information on this. But generally speaking, we wanted to sort of also touch on the fact that, as came up in the back and forth earlier, a request like that, looking at just the allocated CRRs without the auction CRRs, the fundamental change that's happening there is that we are releasing fewer CRRs. If you imagine that the auction just didn't happen and we're looking only at the allocated CRRs, the fundamental change there is releasing fewer CRRs. And so generally speaking, just structurally, we would expect that anything that is reducing the number of CRRs in circulation, and thus, for example, reducing the number of hedging opportunities, is going to increase the likelihood of revenue adequacy. So it's not specific to the fact that it was the auction that we are that we're eliminating, but the fact that we are reducing fewer CRRs, releasing fewer CRRs, that increases that adequacy. Because we recognize that there are other things that have been brought up in this initiative that would also have the net impact in one way or another of releasing fewer CRRs, and that we would expect to have directionally, if not in exact magnitude, move things in the same direction. So with that, I'm going to wrap up our segment on auction efficiency here, and we will then take a break. Well, I'm sorry, we'll take questions and then take a break before moving to Partha, talking a little bit more about the package framework that we introduced at the beginning here. But just to wrap everything up here, I think the key points that we want to take away, the key questions that we want to highlight in this segment and that we would really encourage stakeholder input on going forward is due to the fact that we can't use recent auction data for willing seller simulation for all the reasons we just discussed. How do we predict how much a move to willing seller would change auction results and thus affect market efficiency, CRR availability, and open access to the transmission grid? Secondly, how should the evaluation of willing seller and other auction structure proposals account for this uncertainty and estimate risks? Because for all the reasons we just talked through, on the one hand, so far, I think we have the best analysis of what these results are likely to be that we can produce with the data that is eligible for that kind of analysis. On the other hand, that analysis does leave significant uncertainty about what these results will be. I think enough uncertainty that at least at this point with what we have, it doesn't let us definitively answer some of these key questions about whether these core functions are going to be fulfilled. So on the one hand, we're working with the best that we can. On the other hand, even that best analysis that we can produce leaves a lot of uncertainty to be dealt with. And how should we think about that as we're considering different options? And in mind of that uncertainty, and as we're going to move to in the next segment, are there other measures that could improve auction efficiency with potentially lower risk to hedging tools and value? If there is a lot of uncertainty around this idea, are there ways that we could achieve some of the same benefits with lower uncertainty and risk. So with that, I will pause. Would you like to add anything before we transition?
I think love to hear from stakeholders. I think you covered it really well. I think that the transition really is going to get at the same questions where I think that, yeah, it's really, I think that focusing on the points of like our core functions around, wanting to ensure that we have that we can help facilitate open access and provide hedges at just and reasonable rates. How do we best balance the various levers that we have that can help achieve those goals? And so I think that the willing seller framework, I think, is really helpful in the sense of it provides an opportunity to have those discussions. But given the uncertainty, I think it allows us to really move to other ways that we should be looking at how to best balance those priorities, and particularly maybe it's also a timing discussion around what can we move faster and when to help address some of the concerns. But I think we have questions from Justin and Eric. We can maybe start there before we move to the break.
Hi, this is Justin Cockrell with DC Energy. Hey, bud, I'm on a call. Sorry, my son just. Anyway, I just wanted to. I actually raised my hand earlier. Yeah, I have thoughts on so many things, but I just wanted to highlight something that Hillary was touching on, which is the lack of liquidity on individual paths. And we submitted comments on this back in the first round of comments, I think in December of 2024, did some analysis on individual paths that a generator would want for hedging, and we included that as a PDF there. I think that's an important sort of area to focus on, would be liquidity on individual paths. And another thing to consider, Avram already described, how the centrally clearing, auction based on simultaneous feasibility does such a good job of reconfiguring the network. And one of the things that it does is it allows for the incorporation of new locations. If something was, if a new resource was put onto the grid, you'd be able to hedge that with price discovery at that location. And I don't really think that would be true going forward. You wouldn't have all bids clearing against all bids in this centrally clearing simultaneous feasibility market. So I think that there would be a real liquidity issue at any kind of new location on the grid for a new, whatever, battery or a more granular take on load or anything along those lines. So just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And that might be that we'd like to get feedback from participants on, at least the way, like internally, when we've discussed some of the implications around willing seller design, there's often been a kind of an assumption that if this were to be implemented, hypothetically, that the outcome would likely look like a limited set of trading points. And I think as the DMM had in their presentation, it might be kind of like 4 notifications on where people are looking to trade to and from, but that might involve kind of, as you described, not necessarily all paths, but a limited number of sort of key paths. And it's kind of an open question of and all of these designs, I think, would have sort of similar concept of like, is this really hedging the risk that people need to hedge? What does, where are the trade-offs between sort of having that full path versus sort of a subset of the grid where you have a more liquid market for trading instruments? So appreciate you bringing that up, Justin, because I think that is sort of a key question that we have concern around, just in terms of what the implications are for participants' hedging practices. So thanks.
Great, thank you.
I think, Eric, your hand was next.
Yeah, Eric Little, CalCCA. So I think that the DMM information on what happens under their proposal is helpful, and maybe I've missed it somewhere in there, but I think there's a second piece to it that we asked about, which was, I now understand that load probably loses 17% by going to willing buyer and seller from what they're trying to get in the auction. but there's also a gain from what they would get in the allocation process because you don't hold back for the auction process and you can free up more of the grid. I don't recall seeing that in that analysis, so I'm wondering, is that something that's going to be done? Number one. And number two, does the ISO agree with the analysis put out by DMM as to what impact that would have? Or did you see any issues with the way that it was done or how you would actually implement the proposal?
And maybe I'll respond first to we recognize the request is out there. Hilary touched on that earlier. I think that there's probably still, I think as we move into the solution set, and if there's sort of like, kind of like to whatever degree we have a sort of a one or maybe two different type of proposals where people are gravitating towards these are designs, I think that there is kind of an ability to maybe take on additional analysis around the implications. For the willing seller model, obviously one of the features I think that they highlighted was maybe a relaxation about some of the limitations, including that were sort of limited the ability for people to get through the allocation process. So that's something that we could take on as well. I don't think we had, at least I'll defer to Hilary, I don't think we had anything direct in terms of what the numbers look like in terms of our own, but we'll take that question, maybe think about if there's a way to, I'll make sure that we have sort of a full representation in our next paper, and if we saw any gaps to that. So thanks, Eric.
Okay, thank you.
And
The
last,
only
we
other
do have.
the only other thing I'll add on that is, and this will come up in the next section, that some of the ideas around what that allocation change could look like, sort of ways in which potentially more could be released in the allocation without releasing too much and increasing revenue inadequacy. Some of those measures, such as moving, for example, from the global derate factor to more tailored derate factors on historically inadequate constraints, we were also including in the revenue adequacy section. Those measures actually came up independently as measures that have potential merit just on their own. So that is going to be an active part of the ongoing conversation. And we'll see some of those in the slides that Barb is going to do next.
Great, thank you. And then Torsten.
Yeah, hi, Torsten Keeper with BAMX. My first question is, we've talked a lot and heard a lot about the potential for there to be price discovery benefits from the CRR process, and I think in previous comments we may have requested an evaluation of that. Would it be possible to analyze and compare and see if the current CRR process is serving any real price discovery benefits? From what I've seen, it seems like the link is pretty tenuous.
That's an area that, and you're talking about price discovery in the bilateral market, right? I think that's an area that we would welcome if there are additional ways to get visibility into that. I think that of the metrics that we are considering here, that is one that the ISO has less direct visibility into. And so I think some of the studies that have been done in other areas have come up in that conversation, but I think it is an area that we don't have any analysis yet that we can share on that, and it's an ongoing question of how we can consider that metric.
Yeah, and at least this is something where when we have, obviously I think this is kind of like a feature that a number of participants have said is like a helpful aspect of it. I think it's probably more of a one where other stakeholders weighing in on how they use it, and like it could be in their comments, it could be here. But I think that's probably, getting participant feedback on that aspect, I think probably be most helpful to have kind of a useful dialogue around it. I think Callie has her hand raised. Maybe
I'm sorry, if I may, I had a follow-up question.
Okay.
Yeah, so just looking at the final bullet point here as well, the other measures that could improve auction efficiency. I think that's the root of BAMX's proposal to limit auction participation to entities that have historically or have a reason to be seeking access to the physical transmission system. And that would be something that could be worked into the existing auction structure without these uncertainties that are referenced here. And I think it is clear from the DMM's analysis that both the offer price for the auction CRRs and the quantity of the auction CRRs are contributing to the issue. So I think that the limits that BAMX has proposed could go a long ways towards alleviating at least those quantity concerns. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I know I'm between us and a break, so I'll try and make this brief. I know we like to talk about auction efficiency and revenue adequacy kind of in somewhat siloed conversations, but I think Hillary, in your response to Eric, you kind of touched on what I was thinking for this third bullet is there is a lot of ideas being brought up in the revenue adequacy discussion. The improved loop flows, maybe changes to how the shortfall is being allocated that really get to improving or reducing the uncertainty and risk associated with holding a CRR right now that will improve the auction efficiency. So I'm glad to hear that that is being discussed and that you've recognized, that those changes as well can help improve auction efficiency. So I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of that and that connection remains, because maybe changes that we make in that framework can actually naturally improve the auction efficiency. But that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Abram?
Abram, you might be.
Yeah, sorry, I had to undouble mute. I just wanted to follow up on what Callie just said, because we did have a proposal in our comments in January that was explicitly about changing some of the revenue allocation methodology, just putting a tweak on it that would address some of the significant underfunding. And I didn't see that flowing through on some of the options here. So our thought was, and this is building upon the proposal California made back in June for how to handle underfunding associated with congestion in EDAM areas that's causing CRR underfunding, which was allocated to the balancing account. I think that's in general a principle that could be applied where you're following cost causation principles and you can allocate according to track 1B if you can demonstrate that it's related to something that is cost causation related, like a transmission outage, derate on the transmission lines. But if it's related to shift factor threshold issues, or basically anything, or loop flow, anything related to entities who are not paying for the congestion that they cause, that's probably more appropriate from a cost causation standpoint to be allocated through the balancing account. And the principle there is cost causation. And I think what that would do is you would address some of the extreme levels of underfunding. Not, sometimes there's obviously the counterflow. People made a big deal about that. But if a constraint is 90% underfunded, it's effectively, it's just not acting as a hedge. So I'm hopeful that the proposal that we put in, and we probably didn't call it out as well as we should have in our comments, because we had it in a paragraph in answer to one of the questions, but we would like to see that considered, just to Callie's point.
Thank you. I think that actually is a good transition to the next segment of our conversation. And I'll note that we started with the overarching summary slide on the hypothetical packages, but we are going to go in the next section into some slides that list a few more of the options that have been on the table, including the one you mentioned, Abram, of potentially allocating shortfall to additional parties besides the CRR holders that we do today under 1B. So I think that's a good place to take a break. Shall we take a 10-minute break? Thank you, everyone. It's been a solid 2 hours. We will come back at 3:18. All right. Welcome back, everybody. As we discussed, we are now going to move on to the other two segments of our meeting today. Martha is going to lead a discussion, further discussion of the package framework that we introduced at the top of the meeting. And then our final item is going to be led by Dinesh, talking about some of the feedback on the product definitions draft proposal. With that.
Sure. No, thank you, Hillary. Appreciate it. So I feel like at least having this discussion now is an interesting timing, because I feel like we've already really gotten into a lot of this discussion already from stakeholders, and I feel like that there are. I think what we've heard is that, like, a lot of people have already sort of expressed the fact that they've given a variety of views upon kind of like different reform options that could help address the problem statement that we laid out related to auction efficiency and revenue inadequacy. And that, like, on this slide, we really kind of just touch at a high level that there really are kind of a spectrum of options, and this is really focusing on particularly on the revenue inadequacy, on ways to improve revenue inadequacy. And I think that some of these are obviously currently underway, where there are a variety of processes that we're looking at based on our current authority on how do we better align the day-ahead market, the CRR market, and the day-ahead market in order to improve the revenue adequacy. But there's kind of a sense of like there really is kind of like a host of different options, from how we can look at loop flow modeling, looking at distribution factors, looking at contingency constraints, in order to improve basically the consistency of that design. There's also, I think, been a good discussion, a lot of feedback on reducing or eliminating the shift factor threshold in the day-ahead market, and some of the implications that that could have on the revenue inadequacy outcomes that we're seeing in the CRR processes. I think as well, I think that we've also heard, from people's feedback of like part of the issue of addressing revenue inadequacy could include, various solutions to the CRR the allocation, including, I think there was a proposal out there that people were wanting to discuss on, updating the CR1B to allocate revenue shortfalls to the transmission service providers for late reported outages, as well as, I think, like in terms of like larger systemic changes, maybe a CRR structure that had different classes of payouts based on different priority levels, which could allow for certain parties to have higher priority rights in exchange for paying a potentially a higher charge, either in an allocation process or in the auction, in order to have a higher payout of rights. So at least at a kind of a high level, there's kind of seen a really a large spectrum of options. From the way I would describe it is really focusing in on the model and consistency, which I think we are already, a lot of that stuff is already underway, we're already doing, but to like sort of larger systemic changes that could help address some of the revenue inadequacy impacts that are causing the CRRs to not, from many parties' perspective, not to be as an effective hedge as they would desire. Thanks. And so like this slide really kind of touches on the same thing in terms of what the options look like from an auction efficiency standpoint. And again, kind of going from left to right, where it's kind of like incremental, smaller policy changes all the way up to sort of larger systemic changes. At least maybe talk, looking at the bookends first. I think we recognize that we just had a fairly big discussion on the willing seller framework, which obviously be a very large systemic change. there's kind of a look at, from the no auction change at all, just as a bookend to say, that kind of the ultimate bookend, but there's also proposals such as by Appian Way, which could, where there's could be a change in the allocation methods that could help improve auction efficiency too. In the middle, there's a kind of a number of different options in which we thought we could explore as well. That could include, I think BAMX had referenced theirs, the limiting auction participants to only specific participants that have hedging needs that are demonstratable. There's been a proposal out there, I think, from a couple of different ideas that have been discussed by the Market Surveillance Committee, and particularly I'd maybe highlight the creation of a minimum price bid, which could help address some of the challenges associated with auction inefficiency, as well as I think the MSC also brought up some of the ideas around reversing some of the track 1 and B changes, and particularly the idea of having the constraint by constraint haircut and some of the inefficiencies and risks that such a design could have. And then in the middle, I think there's a number of participants that brought up some of these other ones, including, updating the CRR1B to cap flow reversals at $0. And then the middle one was kind of like the making monthly auctions, the balance of planning periods auctions, and having that be sort of a more effective mechanism to hedge risk, which in turn could drive some efficiency gains. So I think the kind of the punchline is for both of the auction revenue and auction efficiency is there really is kind of a large set of different options that could have bigger and lesser effects on sort of the problem statements itself related to auction efficiency and revenue and accuracy, but could also really change the kind of like what is the how effective are our processes in allowing for participants to obtain effective hedging mechanisms at a just and reasonable rates, terms, and conditions. And so I think that when we're thinking about the different packages of reforms, we're trying to think about like, how do we take different pieces, how do we fit them together to sort of best balance the objectives we have without maybe creating larger risks to the ability to to allow for entities to hedge and address sort of that full list of concerns that Hillary touched upon previously around the different categories of use cases and what the implications might look like. So for this discussion, I think we're really looking for feedback. We've had a good discussion on the willing buyer and seller design with the DMM and stakeholders, but we had a couple other packages, and I'll touch it on the next two slides. But really, I think that Doug Boccioni had brought this up earlier in the conversation. We don't view that these other two packages are the other two packages that we're saying like these are the right solutions, but rather we're trying to get some stakeholder thought around, are there different alternatives that could be packaged together that could help address some of the concerns that entities have raised in terms of auction efficiency or revenue inadequacy, but maybe not create sort of larger systemic risks to the ability to obtain hedge instruments. So kind of like the two that we're really going to be discussing, and I'll go into the details on the next slide. But package 2 in particular is really kind of focusing on the idea of possibly a minimum price or a minimum bid being kind of a mechanism that could be packaged with other reforms and potentially done in a fairly quick manner in order to alleviate some of the current concerns on revenue inadequacy. And then the package 3, just as another concept, is what we describe as like a bifurcated market design where we would allow for higher priority rights to be obtained in exchange for basically paying a higher value or a higher cost for those rights. So If we want to go to the next slide, we can have a really quick discussion around these, because I don't think of these as, you know, we recognize the fact that each of these has sort of gaps and trade-offs, but I think for this one in particular, I thought I'd at least walk through at a conceptual level some of the initial thoughts around this. And the idea around it would be establishing a minimum bid, or potentially a minimum price for CRRs acquired in the auction. And the idea would be that, like, if you're wanting to bid for a positive value CRR, you'd have to, like, let's just say the minimum bid component, you have to bid greater than, say, $1 in order to participate and obtain that right. And as we thought about that, we thought there might also need to be a quote minimum bid for counterflow CRRs as well. The idea would be we'd want to still allow for parties to provide counterflow CRRs, but if we had a $0 or a lower bid, that might create the opportunity to still leverage that counterflow bid to obtain rights that might still drive auction inefficiency and or revenue inadequacy. And so by placing that, placing basically a bid, a minimum bid both for the buy and the sell side might sort of alleviate some of the concerns without creating, but still really allow for that bid not to be so high that participants can't obtain right at a just and reasonable rate if they're actually needing them for hedging purposes. Some of those that we thought was that it could be combined with other changes, such as capping the flow reversals at $0 to create greater confidence in the hedging instruments as well. And so this was kind of really seen as kind of like trying to really balance addressing some of those efficiency gains while assuring that the hedge rates and ensuring like a higher confidence in the instrument. So this is one package. And at least if I were to highlight like some of the feedback we're looking for, I think also thinking about timing and the implementation effort that would be required. This is one in particular where, based on kind of very preliminary internal discussions, it was seen as this is at least has the potential to be implemented potentially quicker than other design options, and could maybe have a reasonable bang for the buck in terms of the impact that it has to the goals. We're going to go to package 3. This is, I think, this is based on some of the feedback we heard from participants as well, which was, I think there's kind of maybe 2 pieces to sort of maybe touch on in terms of like the stakeholder feedback. One of the stakeholder feedbacks was really that there's a sense that the CRRs weren't meeting its base objective because the proration and haircut rules resulted in the CRR and the rules around flow reversal resulted in CRRs that weren't being fully funded and often could be creating a risk to participants. But there was also, I think, in turn, a number of stakeholders expressed concern around the fact that the CRRs are being purchased at a value that is significantly less than day ahead revenue, and a kind of a question of, are they paying for their the fair amount for those rights? And so this kind of concept was trying to balance those 2 objectives, where the idea was to basically allow for potentially a higher priority right. At a minimum, it could be seen as having the first right to the associated transmission revenues, but also I think it'd be probably worth discussing of, if they were to pay a higher amount, would there be sort of an appetite to say, like, no, we'd really allow for full funding of these rights, which could be paid, either by, the transmission service provider and or load, in order to sort of guarantee those rights, the funding of those rights. I think and I think we kind of touched on the goals. I think that really is kind of that trade-off of we're trying to ensure both reasonable compensation for the rights, but also address kind of the risk that some people have brought up in terms of these hedge instruments not being as effective. So I'll stop there. I see Bonnie has her hand raised. I think as well, I'd note that a number of these concepts, I think we could package with other reform elements. I don't think these are necessarily mutually exclusive in terms of the design elements, But we kind of thought that some of these two, between these two packages, we thought there might be a sort of jumping off point where people could say, I like the base element of this design. You should add these additional features, or you should make these additional changes, and that could help really address our concerns that are sort of elusive, are included in the original problem statement. So I'll pause there and see if there's any initial feedback. Bonnie, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities Group. I get the impression from the discussion, Partha, that you and your colleagues are assuming that all CRR holders use them for hedging, and I wonder whether my impression is correct, and if my impression is correct, that in other words you're attributing a hedging purpose to all CRR holders. What's the basis for that?
No, good question, Bonnie. I would say I don't think that is correct. At least in the sense of like, I think that we recognize the fact that there are a number of different entities that have different purposes. This might touch on, I think Doug has his hand raised, so I might just touch on some of the ideas that were floated by BAMX in terms of limiting participation. I think there are a number of fair questions about what the implications of that would look like, and can we identify which participants are using them for hedges, how much could we apply what limitations would we apply to entities that were, might both have a marketing purposes or both have a hedge purpose, but also, could be seen as speculators. So I don't think that we're necessarily assuming, and obviously the DMM's analysis has provided a decent amount of data over the years in terms of like who's procuring CRRs, how are they being used. And so I don't think that we're necessarily just assuming that they're all being used to hedge, but I do think that we have, an idea that we are wanting to have at minimum all participants who are looking to hedge to have a process that provides, that's just and reasonable and provides, a fair access to be able to obtain instruments through our processes. Does that make sense, Bonnie, or do you see it differently?
No, I mean, I think, from my perspective, hedging of physical deliveries is what FERC thinks FTRs are for, and that's what FERC says is important to the functioning of markets. I think that prioritizing the use of CRRs or prioritizing the design so that it supports actual hedging is an important goal. And by the same token, I think that it would be outrageous, frankly, for the CAISO to adopt measures that would make whole entities that buy CRRs with no intention of using them for hedging. I mean, to me, that just would be turning the whole concept of CRRs on its head, and would just be absolutely totally unreasonable.
So that's helpful. So maybe just to make sure I'm connecting the dots, Bonnie, like if we're talking about package 3 and like the full funding, it might be another term of it to say like, hey, if you are you might have a higher price, and like depending on what that price is, that might be, one of the factors. But you might also say, well, in addition to that, there needs to be a demonstration of use, if you're to create that type of design mechanism, and that would be sort of a minimum. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, thanks, Bonnie. That's really helpful feedback.
Next, we have Doug.
Hi, Doug Boccignone for BAMX. I had a question on the package 2 and a comment on 3, but I want to just respond to something Bonnie just said. I agree with what Bonnie was saying, and you know, I'm looking back at the FERC principles. You know, provide open access to transmission and allow hedging of congestion costs in the context of a day-ahead energy market. And you know, I think both of those principles imply that the parties who need the CRRs would be ones who are actually using the transmission system. And I think what our analysis showed was that 90%-ish of the auction CRRs are held by parties that, at least based on the FERC filings, didn't schedule any transmission in the ISO markets. So, you know, I think there's a long way between, you know, having CRRs for people who are using them to hedge and have open access to transmission, and how many CRRs are getting allocated in the ISO's auctions. And that's why BAMX is suggesting, well, if you're concerned about parties who are actually using the transmission system, generators and marketers, you know, people trading energy, you know, do something like what ISO does for the allocation CRRs. And on the question I had about the package 2 is, it seems, I'm just wondering like how you would have both a floor price for the buy CRRs and a ceiling price for the sell CRRs. I mean, how would you, you know, how would you know going in how that's going to work? And also with the floor, I mean, the presentation Roger gave showed that there were quite a large amount of CRRs that were transacted that were, you know, negative value, so below zero. And, you know, so how would you make this work so that parties who, you know, were willing to pay to get out of a CRR position could still do it? It seems like the willing seller design that would happen directly. But if we're trying to do this in the kind of more like just a minor change to the ISO's current auction, I'm just wondering how you would differentiate between the floor and the ceiling.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I would say, like, this is a design concept. We've had a couple of internal meetings. It has not been necessarily fully flushed out in terms of all the implementation steps. I think the idea behind it would be like that there is, like, one way to think about it is that there's almost like an absolute value range of saying, like, you know, you can't submit a bid, either buy or sell, within, you know, from, you know, between, let's just say, I'll make up different numbers for ease, like between 50 cents and negative 50 cents. And that would basically provide an additional, it creates some friction in the auction in terms of the efficiency of clearing those low dollar valued ones, but it also might prevent, some of those more speculative positions that aren't necessarily needed for hedges, and it might have been driving some inefficiency. It might eliminate some of those. The analysis that our team produced, they do have within that the slide had like kind of like the breakdown of where the different prices for bids in the auction, and sort of what the different dollar thresholds, dollar quantities look like. So the idea would be that in effect, if you were going to submit a negative price bid, you'd have to submit it at below, negative. Here, just for example, is below negative 10 cents. If you're looking to purchase one, you have to submit a bid for above $1. We've talked a little bit to PJM and what it looked like, and what their structure looked like. And for their FTR options, they have one where basically they conduct their auction. They don't have the thresholds on the bids, but they basically will not clear their option CRRs that have a clearing price of less than $1. They won't award them as a part of their process. So it's a different way that PJM was thinking about structuring it. But I think it's maybe from an implementation standpoint for obligation CRRs, it seemed like having the minimum bid might be, with the threshold, might be an easier way to effectuate that change.
Okay, thanks for the explanation. And then on the package 3, the priority tiers, I think is an interesting idea. But one thing that strikes me, you said via auction or expanded allocation process. I'm not sure you need it for the allocation. I mean, the allocation CRRs, if you think about like what the load serving entities are paying for them via the access charge, would probably be the highest cost CRRs on the system, right? I mean, I'm sure maybe there's sometimes people are willing in the auction to pay more than, the equivalent of what people pay per megawatt hour for allocated CRRs. So I think I'm not sure you really need to change anything about the allocation as long as you essentially assign that as the baseline payment that people are making, and then I guess you could scale everything relative to that.
No, Doug, thank you for pointing that out. I think I did not articulate that fully, and I think the idea around the expanded allocation process was really to make sure that all entities that were looking to obtain rights, so let's just say that you're a generator, for example, who currently uses the auction structure to procure rights. Obviously we have the OVALSI process for load serving entities outside the area. There's certain requirements in terms of demonstrating and showing that you're a load serving entity using this to hedge. But there could be a similar construct where generators or marketers or other participants could say, hey, I'm willing to pay the higher minimum price in the auction, or an expanded allocation process could serve a similar function where we're basically allowing parties to obtain the rights in exchange for paying what might look like a share of the TAC or some higher cost. That might need to obviously need to be combined with making sure that they are simultaneously feasible, as well as I think that, like as Bonnie alluded to, I think that like her suggestion was that should also have to be a demonstration of needing to use that right for hedging some physical need. But I think that's at least the concept we were trying to throw out there, is we're really wanting to make sure that everybody has access to a process that allows them to obtain hedges at a just and reasonable rate. And the question might be, what does that rate look like? And then there's also a question around what kind of certainty might we provide to people depending upon the rate that they're being charged. So that makes sense.
So yeah, thanks for that. It sounds like kind of implicit in what you're saying is that the existing allocated CRRs would have that higher priority for the full funding.
And there's probably a question of obviously the full funding, to the degree that that came from load. There's probably a question of like what are the implications associated with that. I would think of it, at least in terms of the existing allocations, probably being those higher priority rights. There's probably maybe a fair question of if you were, depending upon what this process looked like, would it be the same priority as the load funded rights? Might it look differently in terms of what the allocation process looked like? But yeah, at a conceptual level, I think that's kind of how we were viewing it.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thanks everybody. We appreciate the chance to share some of our early ideas. I think particularly maybe if we go back to kind of this slide of when we have the various, maybe one more back, we have our various sort of categories of improvements, both to auction efficiency and revenue and adequacy. And I think, as Callie brought up earlier, some of these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, or we have to, to the degree that we can address revenue inadequacy, maybe we're also addressing some of the auction efficiency concerns. And I think what we'd love to sort of hear from participants, we're kind of, a little bit, we've had these discussions through the working group process where people have started to bring forward their ideas. and we really appreciate everybody who's shared their ideas to date. We'd kind of love to hear people's feedback. It could be on the two packages that we've shared. It could be on a different package where you all think of like there's a different way that you'd structure some of these elements to produce a set of changes that would be most impactful. And it could be the case where if you felt like, no, we really missed something that should be included in here as well, but we hadn't considered, we'd love to hear your feedback and that comment. We're looking to basically take people's feedback and to help create a straw proposal design. And that I think the two elements I think that would really want to hear is like one on is on kind of like what is that long-term solution that could be most effective to meet the needs, but also I think really on timing too, where I think we've recognized the fact that there's a sense that like some of these changes might be much more systematic, like kind of like much larger from an implementation, from a design perspective, and other changes such as changes to apply a minimum bid that could be done quicker and might have a fairly high bang for the buck without creating larger risk. So I think that we'll have a comment template. I'm looking to seek feedback, but yeah, really appreciate the discussion today. And maybe with that, we had scheduled, I believe, a break for this time. Relatively speaking, this is obviously, we've now been meeting for less than a half an hour. So my own suggestion might be that we skip this break. I believe Dinesh's slides should take less than an hour to get through. So unless anyone wants to raise their hand requesting another break, I'd suggest we move on to the product definitions discussion. Any stakeholder objections? And Dinesh looks ready too, which is a double, a double benefit.
Yes, Partha. I think the one thing is I'm looking at this take control function and I'm not seeing it work out. So if whoever the event operator is right now, if they could move the slides, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Sorry, you should be able to now.
Okay. Let's see. Perfect. Okay, is this moving properly?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so now turning over to product definition conversation. As Partha said, hopefully this discussion will be under an hour. The goal here is really twofold. One is to first review and discuss feedback that we've received on the straw proposal. And the second is to discuss the stakeholder requests for refinement to the straw proposal. This is all in preparation for a revised straw proposal on product definition with a target published date of around May 31st. Okay. So starting off with the time of use proposal. So we received feedback from 22 commenters. And overall, the response was positive. So 17 commenters expressed general support for the proposal or continued consideration of the time of use proposal. Commenters raised 4 refinement areas to consider. One is modifying the hours in each time of use period. The second being standardizing periods across all days of the week, aka Sundays and holidays, having that same time of use periods as Monday through Saturday, and seasonally adjusting the periods, and then finally adding a 4th time of use period to cover that morning peak. One theme around the comments worth flagging, there were 6 commenters that asked to prioritize discussion on revenue inadequacy caused by the auction. Given continued interest by stakeholders in not only revenue adequacy, but also auction efficiency and product definition. We're seeking to continue development on all three of these areas in parallel, hopefully as demonstrated by today's meeting and sort of the good discussions that have been had. Okay. So 7 commenters addressed the question of which hours should be defined for the midday peak period. And we had 2 kind of distinct alternative proposals emerge. 2 commenters supported shifting the midday peak hours to hour ending 9 through hour ending 16. And this would be with the goal of aligning with existing intercontinental exchange products. And 1 commenter supported a midday peak running from hour ending 8 through hour ending 17. And 5 commenters asked for additional analysis behind sort of the split between midday peak and peak product would be. The commenter who proposed having hour ending 8 to hour ending 17 was SCE, and Southern California Edison also provided additional analysis to support this alternative proposal. So as you can see on the right here, this chart that was included by SCE shows the straw proposal time of use periods under with peak and midday peak. It also shows the hours under discussion here, highlighted in green. Okay. So SCE used a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, or a KS test for short, to compare whether the morning hours price distributions are more or less similar to other hours with their price distributions. So the smaller the difference here, the smaller the maximum difference between the distribution of the 2 things at hand. So idea here is that also indicates that the distribution curves may look more similar, meaning that the groupings then follow similar distribution patterns. So for example, here, if you look at that bottom row, SCE found that hour ending 9 price distributions tracked very closely to hour ending 10 through hour ending 17 price distributions. And therefore, the analysis indicates that from SCE's perspective, hour ending 9 should be grouped with hour ending 10 through hour ending 17, rather than with the hour ending 7 and hour ending 8. SCE also noted that hour ending 8 appeared to function as a transition hour, with the idea that as there's more and more solar resources on the grid, SCE believes that hour ending 8 may trend towards midday peak characteristics, and therefore should also be included in the midday peak hours. Hence their proposal that hour ending 9 and hour ending 8 should be grouped with hour ending 10 through hour ending 17. Okay. Moving on, so second refinement area with significant commenter engagement was on the treatment of Sundays and holidays. So currently Sundays and holidays are the whole days are treated as off-peak. And the question here is whether Sundays and holidays should have a similar time of use treatment and period distribution as the rest of the week. So we had 13 commenters weigh in here, and the direction of the feedback is fairly clear. So 8 supported having Sundays and holidays follow the same time of use periods as Monday through Saturday, and 7 stakeholders requested additional analysis. SCE also provided analysis here showing that Sundays and holidays follow similar trends as other days of the week, and therefore this underlined their belief that Sundays and holidays could also benefit from having similar time of use periods as other days of the week, rather than being purely off-peak. So kind of two sets of charts on the left. starting on the left, we've got two box plots. The top box plot shows the trimmed Monday through Saturday marginal cost of congestion distribution for the SCE zone. And then the bottom box plot shows the same, but for Sunday and holiday. Visually, the two box plots look similar, thereby indicating a similar trend of the distribution. On the right, SCE performed another KS test here on historical marginal cost of congestion data. And this is specifically on the SCE DLAP from January 2024 through November 2025. And the idea here is to compare 1 hour with all the other hours of the day. And if an hour's distribution, it looks more different than the other hour's distribution, then that hour is highlighted, that kind of box is highlighted red. And if they're more similar, then boxes are highlighted blue. And the goal here is also to visually look at it and say, well, those bottom two heat maps for Sunday and holiday look quite similar to the rest of the days of the week, kind of similar to what we're seeing in the box plots. So moving on to the other two refinements that received significant comment attention. So 9 commenters discussed seasonality, 1 in support, 7 requesting additional analysis, and 1 sort of underlaying that consistent year-round periods should be sufficient for meeting the variation between seasons. On adding a 4th time of use period, specifically looking at that morning peak as kind of having its own time of use period, 10 commenters provided feedback, with 6 supporting further analysis and discussion, and 4 cautioning against adding additional complexity to the CRR program. 2 other questions that came up. 3 commenters asked how long-term CRRs would transition to a new product definition. And this is something we'll explore a little bit in the next slide. And then 2 commenters also asked about the interplay with EDAM. So this slide here considers a hypothetical, right? So, we're starting with the straw proposal, right? And, with the additional comments and feedback and analysis that we've received on Sundays and holidays, the question here is, what could that transition look like for long-term CRRs? So first thing to consider, focusing on sort of column 3 to column 4, and that is the question of, okay, how do current long-term on-peak CRRs look like being split up between midday peak and peak long-term CRRs? And the idea here is to provide the same hedge pre-transition as post-transition. So an example here, one could imagine, let's say, having 10 megawatts of on-peak CRRs, long-term on-peak CRRs that currently cover hour ending 7 to hour ending 22. These CRRs could be transitioned into 10 megawatts of the midday peak, covering hour ending 10 to hour ending 17, and then 10 megawatts of peak long-term CRRs, covering hour ending 7 to hour ending 9 and hour ending 18 to hour ending 22 per the existing straw proposal, not including any potential refinements. And the idea here is that between that long-term midday peak CRR and the long-term peak CRR, that should give the same hedge as the current long-term on-peak CRR. And hence that kind of column 3 to column 4, where the on-peak splits into those two different products, accounting for the new time of uses. Second thing under consideration in this hypothetical is, well, what if Sundays and holidays were transitioned from all off-peak to the new time of use periods? And one way to think about this would be to think about this as a two-step, right? So given that we've got analysis showing that Sundays and holidays look like they have similar normalized price distributions as the rest of the week, the logic here would be that current on-peak CRRs would be a better match for the current Sunday and holiday hedging during the on-peak hours than what we've got, which is the current off-peak hours, providing sort of coverage for the whole day on Sundays and holidays. So a potential transition could be having on-peak CRRs covering Sundays and holiday on-peak hours, and having off-peak CRRs continue covering off-peak hours on Sundays and holidays. And then combining that with that first concept that on-peak CRRs could be split into midday peak and peak long-term CRRs of the same hedging value, one ends up with that fourth column, right, of how long-term CRRs for Sundays and holidays could be reflected post-transition, assuming sort of the straw proposal. Okay. With that, that's sort of the things that I wanted to cover for the time of use section. Any comments or questions at this time before we move to the treatment of storage?
Just give a few folks the time to raise your hand. I don't see any coming in at this time, Dinesh.
Okay, yeah. Okay, we'll keep it moving then. So reviewing sort of what we've heard on the treatment of storage topic. On the storage as an auction sync proposal, the commenter feedback was also broadly supportive. 15 commenters in total discussed the proposal, of which 13 supported including standalone storage as some sort of eligible auction sync. Within that group, 4 supported expanding eligibility further to other types of storage resources. So currently the proposal is limited to standalone storage. The idea here is maybe considering hybrids or co-locateds as well. And one commenter offered a different view, which was that storage eligibility as sinks should be limited to circumstances where there's a demonstrated need to hedge congestion costs, risks for charging energy. So idea here is that if a storage resource could, demonstrate that need, then that is something that should be eligible. But if it's a storage resource that is charging from the grid and it's unspecified, it's something that that storage resource may not need to be designated as a sink. As noted earlier, there were 6 commenters that were prioritizing discussion on revenue inadequacy caused by the auction. And hopefully we had good discussion earlier today that sort of supported that prioritization there. Okay. So we had 6 commenters that discussed also including storage resources in the allocation. 2 supported that inclusion and 4 supported additional discussion here. Sort of, in this realm, one stakeholder requested on principle that the concept would be to treat all forms of storage equally and consistently, and that therefore the ISO should allow LSEs to sync to nodes of any storage technology during the allocation process, as from this stakeholder's viewpoint, pumped hydro storage and battery storage should be receiving that same treatment. And currently, pumped storage hydro is something that is eligible as a node in the allocation, and also pump storage pumping of water is considered measured demand and eligible load for CRR nominations. So 2 commenters clarified that making storage nodes eligible as sinks in the allocation, and that question about counting pumping or charging load as eligible load for CRR nominations are 2 separate questions that could be worth discussing here. And sort of the underlying response here is that, maybe they shouldn't be conflated in a singular response, but really kind of taken as 2 different pieces in the revised straw proposal. We also received a specific request from the Department of Market Monitoring, and that was that the ISO clarify the intent of FERC Order 841 with respect to pumped hydro storage in the CRR allocation. Okay, with that, any questions or comments on the product definition topics at this time? Okay. Oh, okay. See a hand from Justin.
Hey, thank you very much for going through all that. I just wanted to highlight that one reason that the time of use reform to add the peak solar is a priority item is because it's really important if you're going to better model loop flows. If you're going to say, oh, okay, these constraints experience, a lot of their capacity is taken up by loop flows. You have to have in there, the peak solar hours and differentiate those from other hours, because a lot of times the loop flow is really happening when there's a ton of solar coming in from the southwest. So if you drastically reduced the amount of available capacity on those constraints to more accurately model for loop flow, you'd actually be inaccurate during some hours. So it's an important thing in order to be able to improve the CRR model to account for loop flow. Also, it's an important thing, almost like order of operation. It needs to be done before or at the same time as adding the eligibility to sync CRRs at battery locations, because if you're not able to differentiate between those time periods, you're not really going to get much benefit out of having those biddable locations. So just wanted to highlight the importance of getting that, getting those the different hours, so that it really does help make the CRRs more functional for the batteries, and it recognizes patterns in flow that people could use not only to improve hedging, but also to improve the modeling.
Appreciate your comments there, Justin. Could you remind me what entity you're coming from again?
Oh, DC Energy.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Abram, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with a little aside based on Justin's comment, which is, and I agree with Justin, is really important to model loop flows really well. But we submitted a proposal, and several other stakeholders did as well, in the roadmap process, about the importance of not just modeling loop flows, but determining the rights to use California's system, especially for entities that are outside of California, and making sure that that isn't, continuously increasing. So I do think it is great for the CRR model to better model the loop flows. But I think one of the things that has happened over time, as more and more resources have been, especially renewable resources, have been developed in the desert Southwest, both by California entities, but also by EDAM and Markets Plus entities, is that those resources, 40% of their flow goes on California's grid. And, there needs to be some mechanism to basically assign those rights as a key way of addressing the revenue inadequacy problem, and also just coming up with a fair allocation so that you don't see California entities' rights to use their own grid, consistently deteriorating year after year after year because California is modeling its own system, but the loop flows are getting, essentially unlimited rights to use California's grid, and those loop flows are growing. So I just want, it's unrelated to this working group, but I think it's a really important point about the loop flows, that it's not just about modeling the loop flows, but I think, we seem to be very concerned about auction inefficiency, which is the profits associated with CRRs, but rather blasé about the fact that entities outside of California are able to use California's grid without, without paying for the congestion that they cost. And that's resulting in the revenue inadequacy that CRR market participants, both the speculative type as well as the load serving entities, are extremely concerned about.
Appreciate that. I
Albert.
think, yeah, I think that is something that, like you mentioned there is, oh, sorry. I was actually just going to pass it to y'all in the room if there's anything in terms of the the congestion revenue allocation working group and initiative. That seems like a comment that is directed somewhat in that direction.
There's a vote in the roadmap discussion about this, and I think Western Seams coordination, this falls under that. And I think if market participants are interested in addressing this issue, they should ask California to prioritize that initiative in the roadmap. Thank you.
Thanks, Abram. Yeah, just to respond real quick, I think that certainly there's a lot of discussion on that and the recent CRA meeting associated with the allocation of congestion between entities. I think there's certainly like a two-way tie-in, as you're alluding to, where the outcomes of there could affect the ultimate design for how we're going to address the congestion, the revenue sufficiency issues in the CAISO BA. So yeah, appreciate your feedback there, and I think we certainly are connecting in those same parallel issues. So if anyone else from the group wants to weigh in, appreciate it. But yeah, thanks for your feedback.
Yeah, and thanks for calling that out. I need to go back and watch the recording of that EDAM meeting because I was out of town during that, but appreciate that this is starting to get a lot more attention.
Great, appreciate that, Abram. Okay, with that, Hillary, would you like to close us out here?
Yeah, this brings us to the end of our agenda. So first of all, I think we can pause for a moment. If anyone has thoughts or questions about anything that came up today, feel free to put your hand up. Overall, we covered a lot of ground, so thank you everybody for helping us think through, as we're looking to refine the straw proposal on the product definition side and work towards a straw proposal on the other two areas. We're looking forward to hearing your feedback on how to parse all the options that we have on the table. One thing that I'll call out, it was on the slides, but I'm realizing we haven't spoken to it verbally, and this is something that if you have thoughts on this, we would welcome this in the comments. One of the reasons that we lumped auction efficiency and revenue inadequacy together in the same portion of the agenda today and considered those options at least partially together, but kept product definition separate, is that as we've thought through some of the options that we're hearing are a priority on the product definition side, so far, those have seemed to be compatible with most of the options that we're considering in the other two areas. So we would like to keep moving ahead with these things on product definition, and we don't see that there's a lot of contingency on what we choose in other areas. But if you see it differently and see some interdependencies here, let us know. But as we noted on the slides, you know, when the slide earlier that Partha presented with the different packages, so far, as we're looking at it, these updates to the product definition seem like they would be compatible with the options, the whole range of options that we're considering on auction efficiency and revenue adequacy. So just to highlight that, if you see it differently, we would love to hear it. But generally speaking, seeing no hands up, we are looking forward to your feedback on the topics we covered today. We are going to be taking comments. That template will be posted tomorrow, due in a couple of weeks. As Dinesh mentioned, we are looking to move towards a revised straw proposal on product definition towards the end of May, although that is still tentative. And we are also working towards an initial straw proposal on the other two areas. So thank you, everybody, for your conversation today. Thank you, Roger, for presenting. I will reiterate, as has been the case, you know, through these meetings, we've had a lot of great stakeholder presentations. If any of you would like to present at any future meetings, let us know. Reach out anytime, even if the next public meeting has not been scheduled yet, and we're happy to hear perspectives. So that's an open offer. But thank you all for your thoughts today. And Partha, would you like to close us out?
Just maybe one other thing in terms of, well, obviously the comment tool, I'd love to have people think critically around, you know, what changes and packages are needed, as well as timing. I think we could imagine things like multiple phases where, especially if there is something that's perceived as an impactful change, that might be quicker to implement and make a difference while we still consider other longer term changes. The timing and those different packages, I think, would be sort of really key to the feedback. But yeah, really appreciate the engagement today, as Hillary said. Appreciate everyone's, you know, thoughtful sharing of ideas. So yeah, Brenda, please take it away.
All right.
Thank you, Hillary, Partha, and Dinesh, and those folks who are participating in today's meeting, and Roger, who isn't here with us. But thanks so much. We definitely want to go over really quickly. That comment template will hopefully be posted tomorrow. I will make sure a notice goes out in case there is a quick, like a small delay, just to help folks remind themselves that the template is posted, but we will keep that deadline at May 6th. So further notice. Also, if you can help move the slide for me, Ryan, for the next page. I don't think I've access, or Dinesh, I believe Dinesh. Thank you. We do have, I did share earlier, the Congestion Revenue Rights Initiative webpage is also there, but also those who also can follow us on the relevant notices, it's also tagged within that page, but this is a quick link that showcases everything in this initiative that have been posted in the past. And then also feel free to contact me for any questions or ISO stakeholder affairs. Next slide. And then lastly, we did have a few blogs posted recently. The first major one was like the stakeholders opposing registration. We are starting to get ready for that opening of that registration pretty soon in May. Also, for sponsorship opportunities, if you are interested, please go ahead and circle back with your organizations in order to get that situated and ready to go. And then the latest one that we just launched a few days ago is the podcast with the featuring the frequency band. It's featuring Becky Robinson and I believe Paul Dockery, who will be hosting the first episode of Getting the Most from Transmission. And this is highlighting two experts in the field. One is our Professor Kyrie Baker, and the next one is Rob Gremlich, the president of Grid Strategies. So feel free to listen in. We do have that link posted there as well. You can also listen in through YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. So with that, I think we could go ahead and wrap up our meeting. Thanks everyone, and thanks everyone for your participation. This recording will be posted within the next few business days as well on our YouTube channel and on the web page. Take care.
All right, that concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.